Chapter 1. The world that made Pompeii. To understand Pompeii, you must first understand the world that created it. You must travel back not merely to the first century of the Common Era, but further still, to the deep roots of a civilization that grew up along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, nurtured by warm winds and the fertile soil of volcanic earth, shaped by centuries of conquest and commerce, by religion and superstition, by the endless human hunger for beauty, comfort, and meaning. The Italian peninsula is a long, narrow finger of land that reaches down from the Alps into the middle of the Mediterranean, a geographical fact that determined the destiny of every people who ever lived upon it. To the north, the great mountain barrier of the Alps separated Italy from the Celtic tribes of Gaul and the Germanic peoples beyond. To the south, the toe of the boot nearly touched Sicily, which itself was only a short crossing from the coast of Africa. The sea surrounded Italy on three sides, and the sea was everything. It was the highway of trade, the medium of conquest, the source of fish and salt and all the goods that made civilization possible. Within this peninsula, the region known as Campania holds a special place in the ancient imagination. Campania was, and remains, one of the most beautiful stretches of land in all of Europe. Its soil is extraordinarily fertile, enriched by millennia of volcanic activity, black and deep, and capable of producing harvests of almost unimaginable abundance. The Greeks who first colonized the region in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era called it Campania Felix, the happy land, the fortunate land, and there was no exaggeration in the name. The climate was mild, tempered by the sea, with winters that were cool but rarely harsh and summers that were long and golden, and filled with the scent of ripening grapes and figs. The mountains that rose behind the coastal plain shielded the lowlands from the worst of the northern winds, and the bay that curved around the southwestern coast was one of the finest natural harbors in the ancient world. At the center of this fortunate landscape stood a mountain. To look at it from the bay, it seems almost modest, a rounded cone rising from the plain with a gentle and deceiving grace. It does not have the sharp, dramatic profile of the volcano in a child's drawing. It is broader, lower, more like a sleeping giant than a sharp-edged peak. Its slopes were covered with vineyards and orchards and the dark green of oak and beech forests. Its soil was so rich that farmers had cultivated it for thousands of years, pushing their terraces and their fields higher and higher up its flanks. In the centuries before the Great Eruption, there was not a single person alive in the region who knew that this mountain was a volcano. The last time it had erupted in any significant way was so long ago that no human memory preserved the event. The mountain was simply there, a permanent and reassuring feature of the landscape, a backdrop to daily life, a source of agricultural richness. Its name was Vesuvius. The people who would eventually call the slopes of Vesuvius home arrived in waves over many centuries. The earliest inhabitants of Campania were peoples whose names and cultures have largely been lost to history. The Apusai, the Ausons, obscure tribes who left behind little more than the faintest traces in the archaeological record. After them came the Oscans, an Italic people who spoke a language related to Latin but distinct from it. A language of rolling vowels and soft consonants that would survive in Pompeii in graffiti and inscriptions long after Latin had become the official language of the Roman world. The Oscans were farmers and traders, practical and earthbound, and it was probably they who first established the settlement that would become Pompeii, choosing a natural lava terrace above the mouth of the Sarno River as the site for their town. But before the Romans, before even the full flowering of Oscan culture, the most important influence on Campania came from across the sea. Beginning in the 8th century before the Common Era, Greek colonists began to establish settlements along the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily. These Greeks came primarily from the overcrowded cities of the Aegean world, driven by hunger for land and opportunity. And they brought with them not only their language and their religion but their architecture, their art, their philosophical traditions, and their ideas about what a city should look like and how citizens should live. The Greeks founded the city of Cumae, just north of what would become Naples, around 740 before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest Greek colonies in the western Mediterranean. From Cumae, Greek influence spread throughout Campania. The Greeks brought the vine and the olive to the region, although both may have already been grown there in some form. More importantly, they brought the temple, the agora, the idea of civic space as a theater for public life. The Doric columns and triangular pediments that would later appear in Pompeii's earliest temples were expressions of this deep Greek inheritance. The Etruscans, too, left their mark on Campania. This mysterious and sophisticated people, who had built a powerful civilization in central Italy in the centuries before Rome's rise, extended their influence southward into Campania during the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. Pompeii itself was probably under Etruscan domination for a period, and the layout of the earliest city, with its grid of streets and its planned civic spaces, may reflect Etruscan town planning principles. The Etruscans were skilled metalworkers, gifted artists, and enthusiastic traders, and they added another layer of cultural complexity to the already rich mix of peoples and traditions that was shaping Campania. Then came the Samnites. In the 5th century before the Common Era, the mountain peoples of the Apennines, the fierce and warlike Samnites, swept down from their highland strongholds and overwhelmed the Greek and Etruscan cities of the Campanian coast. The Samnites were a different kind of people from the cosmopolitan city dwellers they conquered. They were herdsmen and warriors, organized into tribal confederacies rather than city-states, and they brought with them a rougher, more martial culture. But they were not incapable of learning, and in Campania they absorbed much of what the Greeks and Etruscans had built. The city of Pompeii under Samnite rule grew substantially. It was during the Samnite period, between roughly 480 before the Common Era, that Pompeii took on the basic form that archaeologists have uncovered. The Samnites built the city walls, expanded the public spaces, constructed the first versions of many of the temples that would survive into the Roman period, and created the dense, irregular street network that gave Pompeii its characteristic character. And then came Rome. The story of how Rome came to dominate all of Italy is one of the great narratives of ancient history, a story of relentless military expansion, political genius, and cultural absorption that transformed a small city on the Tiber into the ruler of the known world. Campania fell under Roman influence gradually, through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic alliance. The Latin War of the 4th century before the Common Era, the 3 Samnite wars that followed, the Social War of 91 to 87 before the Common Era, in which the Italian allies of Rome rose up demanding full Roman citizenship. All of these conflicts shaped the relationship between Rome and the cities of Campania. Pompeii took an active part in the Social War, fighting against Rome, and when the city was besieged and eventually captured by the Roman general Sulla in 89 before the Common Era, its fate as a Roman colony was sealed. Sulla settled his veteran soldiers in Pompeii, establishing it as a proper Roman colonia with all the legal and administrative apparatus that entailed. The city's official Latin name became Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompeianorum, a mouthful that reflected both Sulla's family name and the devotion of Pompeii's people to the goddess Venus. But this was not the end of tension between the old inhabitants and the new. For decades after Sulla's colonization, the Oscan-speaking original population and the Latin-speaking Roman settlers lived side by side with a degree of mutual suspicion, competing for control of the city's political institutions, maintaining their separate cultural identities. The graffiti on Pompeii's walls testify to this complexity. Oscan inscriptions appear alongside Latin ones. Oscan names persist in the electoral notices that covered the city's facades. The process of cultural integration was gradual, messy, and never fully complete, and this tension between old and new local and Roman, is one of the most fascinating aspects of Pompeii's character. By the time of the eruption in 79 of the Common Era, Pompeii had been a Roman city for more than a century and a half. It was thoroughly embedded in the Roman world, a prosperous provincial town of perhaps 11,000 to 20,000 inhabitants, depending on which modern estimate you accept. It was not a great city by Roman standards. Rome itself held perhaps 1 million people. Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage all dwarfed Pompeii. Even within Campania, Capua and the new city of Neapolis, Naples, were larger and more important. But Pompeii was prosperous, busy, and culturally ambitious. It had everything a proper Roman city should have: a forum, temples, a basilica for legal business, public baths, a large theater, a smaller covered theater and amphitheater, a palestra for athletic training, a market hall, and an extraordinary density of shops, bars, brothels, bakeries, fulleries for washing cloth, and all the other establishments that served the daily needs of its population. What made Pompeii wealthy was its location. It sat at the mouth of the Sarno River, which gave it access to the rich agricultural hinterland of Campania. The river was navigable by small boats, and goods from the interior, grain and wine and olive oil and wool, could be shipped down to Pompeii's harbor, and from there to markets throughout the Mediterranean. Conversely, the luxury goods of the wider Roman world, Spanish silver and Egyptian papyrus and Eastern spices and Gallic pottery, flowed into Pompeii through its port. The city was also a center of manufacturing, particularly the production of garum, the fermented fish sauce that was as essential to Roman cooking as soy sauce is to much of Asian cuisine today. Pompeian garum was exported across the empire, a signature product whose amphorae have been found as far away as Britain and the Black Sea. The volcanic soil of Vesuvius produced wines of particular quality. Pompeian wine was famous throughout the Roman world, though contemporary sources suggest it was not always the most reliable product, and was suspected of giving drinkers terrible headaches if consumed in quantity. The vine-covered slopes of the mountain produced harvests of great richness, and the wine trade was one of the pillars of the local economy. So this was the world into which Pompeii was born and in which it flourished, a world of Roman order and Oscan memory, of Greek artistic inheritance and Samnite practicality, of volcanic soil and Mediterranean commerce, of gods and gladiators and everyday human struggles. A world that had been building for centuries, and that seemed, in the summer of 79 of the Common Era, as permanent and solid as the mountain that overlooked it. Chapter 2. Building a city on a volcano. The site of Pompeii was chosen long before anyone living there could have imagined what lay beneath the earth on which they built. The earliest settlers, those obscure Oscan-speaking peoples of the first millennium before the Common Era, were drawn to the location by a combination of practical advantages that any sensible farmer or trader would recognize immediately. The land was high enough above the surrounding plain to be defensible and to avoid the seasonal flooding of the Sarno River below. The river itself provided fresh water and a route to the sea. The harbor at the river's mouth offered shelter for boats, and the volcanic soil all around was astonishingly fertile, capable of producing crops in abundance with relatively little effort. The earliest traces of human settlement on the site of Pompeii date to the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, though there may have been even earlier, more ephemeral occupation. These first inhabitants left behind little more than pottery fragments and the occasional bronze tool. But from these humble beginnings, over the course of several centuries, a real city grew. The peculiar geography of the site shaped everything about how Pompeii developed. The ancient lava flow from a prehistoric eruption of Vesuvius had created an irregular plateau, roughly oval in shape, that stood somewhat above the surrounding plain. The edges of this plateau fell away in irregular slopes, providing natural protection on several sides. The plateau was not perfectly flat. It tilted gently from north to south, and this slope influenced the drainage of rainwater and the layout of streets. The city that grew up on this plateau was never laid out on a perfect grid in the way that some planned Roman colonies were. Instead, it grew organically, with different neighborhoods and different orientations, reflecting the different periods and peoples who had built and rebuilt it over the centuries. The oldest part of Pompeii, sometimes called the Altstadt or Old City by modern archaeologists, was the southwestern corner of the plateau, where the Temple of Apollo and the earliest Forum were located. This was the religious and civic heart of the Oscan city, and the irregular, slightly curved street pattern in this area reflects its great antiquity. Its streets worn into paths by generations of feet long before anyone thought to pave them with stone. Moving outward from this ancient core, the city expanded during the Samnite period of the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, when Pompeii grew wealthy enough to invest in real urban infrastructure. The Samnites who controlled Pompeii during this period were not the crude mountain warriors of Roman propaganda. They were sophisticated people who had absorbed much of Greek culture while retaining their own traditions, and their building programs in Pompeii reflected this dual inheritance. They laid out the large Doric temple, one of the oldest standing structures in the city, on a commanding position in the southern part of the Forum area. They built the triangular Forum, a curious three-sided public space at the edge of the plateau, overlooking the plain below, which served as the precinct for the temple of Doric columns dedicated to Hercules or Minerva, or perhaps both. They constructed the large theater in the southwestern part of the city, taking advantage of the natural slope of the terrain, in the manner of Greek theaters, to create raked seating without the need for extensive earthworks. But the most distinctive feature of Samnite Pompeii was its houses. The wealthy merchants and landowners of the Samnite period built their homes in a style that would define Pompeian domestic architecture for centuries. These were inward-looking houses, presenting a modest exterior to the street, but opening up internally around a central open courtyard called the atrium. The atrium was the heart of the Samnite house, a formal reception space where the master of the house received clients and conducted business, where the household altar stood and the ancestors were honored, where the rain fell through the central opening in the roof into the impluvium, the shallow rectangular pool below. Behind the atrium, deeper in the house, was the tablinum, the study or reception room of the paterfamilias, and beyond that, in the more luxurious houses, the garden or peristyle, a colonnaded courtyard open to the sky and planted with herbs and flowers and sometimes trees. Some of the grandest houses in Pompeii date from this Samnite period or show their origins in it. The House of the Faun, the largest private dwelling in Pompeii, occupying an entire city block of some 3,000 square meters, began as a Samnite mansion of extraordinary ambition. Its name comes from a small bronze statue of a dancing faun found in its atrium, a charming and slightly rustic figure that seems oddly humble given the grandeur of its setting. The house had 2 atria, 2 peristyles, a series of formal reception rooms decorated with fine mosaic floors, and most spectacularly, the original location of one of the greatest surviving works of ancient art, the Alexander mosaic, a vast floor mosaic depicting the battle between Alexander the Great and Darius of Persia, now in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. The family that owned this house was wealthy beyond the measure of most of their contemporaries, and they wanted the world to know it. The streets of Samnite Pompeii were not yet paved. Visitors walked on the natural surface of the lava plateau, which in wet weather became muddy and treacherous. The city had no formal drainage system. Rainwater ran where it would. Fresh water came from private cisterns that collected rainwater, from the wells that tapped the underground water table, and from the Sarno River below. This would change with the coming of the Romans. Roman colonization under Sulla transformed Pompeii in ways both deep and superficial. On the surface, the changes were dramatic. The Romans built new public buildings in the Forum, imposing their characteristic architecture of arches and vaults, and massive stone construction on a city that had previously built largely in the local limestone called opus incertum. They laid new floors of marble in the temple precincts. They established a new political order, with Roman-style magistrates and a local senate of decurions who managed municipal affairs according to Roman legal principles. New Latin inscriptions began to appear on the walls alongside the old Oscan ones. But the most practically significant Roman contribution to Pompeii was infrastructure. In the early 1st century of the Common Era, probably during the reign of Augustus, Pompeii was connected to the great Roman aqueduct system of Campania. The Aqua Augusta, one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world, was built by Augustus's general Agrippa to supply water to the naval base at Misenum and the cities along the Bay of Naples. Pompeii was connected to this system, and the effect on daily life in the city was transformative. For the first time, Pompeii had a reliable, year-round supply of fresh water under pressure. The water entered the city at a Castellum Aquae, a distribution tower at the northern edge of the city, and from there it was distributed through a network of lead pipes running under the streets to public fountains, private houses, and the public baths. The public fountains were placed at regular intervals throughout the city, never more than about 80 meters from any point, so that every resident could reach fresh water easily. These fountains were simple, practical things. A stone basin with a pipe projecting from a wall decorated with a carved mask, usually an animal or divine face, through which the water flowed constantly. The constant flow was not waste but necessity, because the system had no mechanism for shutting off the water. It flowed day and night, and the overflow ran into the streets and helped flush the gutters. The marks left by the hands of generations of Pompeians on the stone rims of these fountains, worn smooth by the touch of thousands of people over decades, are among the most moving relics of daily life in the city. The baths that the Romans built, or expanded from earlier Samnite foundations, were even more transformative. In the Roman world, the public bath was not merely a place to get clean. It was a social institution as important as the forum, a daily gathering place where all classes of Roman society, at least the free population, could meet, converse, exercise, and maintain the networks of social obligation that held the Roman community together. Pompeii had 3 major bath complexes by the time of the eruption: the Stabian Baths, the Forum Baths, and the Central Baths, as well as a number of smaller private establishments. The largest of these, the Stabian Baths, had separate men's and women's sections, each with a changing room, a cold room with a cold water plunge pool, a warm room for gradual acclimatization, and a hot room where the air was thick with steam and the walls ran with condensation. The heating was achieved by the hypocaust system, a Roman invention of genius in which hot air from a furnace circulated under raised floors and through hollow tiles in the walls, creating a whole-room sauna effect that must have been extraordinarily effective in the cool months of the year. The streets of Roman Pompeii were paved with large blocks of local volcanic basalt, a hard, dark stone that wore well under heavy use and gave the city its characteristic dark gray coloring. The paving was not smooth. The blocks were slightly convex in cross-section, so that rainwater drained to the gutters on either side. At intersections, large stepping stones were placed to allow pedestrians to cross without stepping into the gutter or the street surface, which would have been contaminated with animal dung and worse. These stepping stones were positioned so that cartwheels could pass between them, a characteristic spacing that has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the gauge of Roman wheeled vehicles with some precision. The wheel ruts worn into the basalt paving stones of Pompeii are another of those deeply human relics that the city provides in abundance. They are not incidental. The main thoroughfares of Pompeii show ruts worn inches deep into the hard volcanic rock by the passage of countless carts and wagons over the course of generations. You can stand in the Via dell'Abbondanza, the main east-west street of Pompeii, and put your foot in a rut worn by a cartwheel 2,000 years ago, and the physical reality of those daily journeys, the rumble of wooden wheels on stone, the cry of oxen, the shouts of drivers, becomes suddenly and surprisingly present. The city grew and changed throughout the first century of the Common Era. The reign of Augustus, from 27 before the Common Era to 14 of the Common Era, brought a new wave of construction to Pompeii as to cities throughout the empire. The Forum was remodeled and beautified. New temples were built, including the Temple of the Genius of Augustus, which served the imperial cult that was one of the cornerstones of Roman political religion. The amphitheater, which had been built in the Sullan period and was one of the oldest surviving amphitheaters in the Roman world, was restored and expanded. The Palestra, the large exercise ground adjacent to the amphitheater, was given a formal colonnaded enclosure with a large swimming pool at its center. But the earthquake of 62 of the Common Era set a different kind of challenge. It was a severe earthquake, the kind that the Roman world recognized as a portent of divine displeasure, and it caused massive destruction in Pompeii and the surrounding region. Seneca, the philosopher, writing in the immediate aftermath, described the terror it caused, the collapse of buildings, the panic of the population, the sense that the solid earth itself had become unreliable. The earthquake of 62 was not a random event. It was part of the ongoing volcanic unrest of the region, a symptom of the pressure building in the magma chamber beneath Vesuvius. But no one living in Pompeii in 62 could have known that. They rebuilt. And that is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Pompeii in its final decades, the evidence of vigorous, optimistic rebuilding. When Vesuvius finally erupted in 79, the city was in the middle of a massive construction program. New houses were being built, old ones expanded and redecorated. The public buildings of the Forum were being repaired and embellished with new marble facings and new statuary. The Temple of Isis, the Egyptian goddess whose cult had spread throughout the Roman world, had just been completely rebuilt after the earthquake by a wealthy freedman, and its walls were being repainted with elaborate mythological scenes. The central baths, the newest and most up-to-date bathing establishment in the city, was still under construction, its walls rising but its roof not yet complete. The city was not dying. It was growing, investing, planning for a future that would never come. Chapter 3. The people of Pompeii. A city is not its buildings. A city is its people, and the people of Pompeii were as varied and complex as any population in any city of the ancient world. To walk through Pompeii is to walk through a social universe of extraordinary richness, a world of patricians and slaves, of merchants and prostitutes, of priests and gladiators, of mothers and children and old men sitting in the sun. The eruption preserved not just the buildings but, in extraordinary ways, the people themselves. Not their bodies exactly, though even those in the form of plaster casts, but their words, their images, their traces, their very personalities. Let us begin with the people at the top. The Decurions, the local council of Pompeii, were the ruling class of the city. They were typically men of property and education, landowners and successful businessmen who had achieved a certain level of wealth that made them eligible for participation in the formal political life of the community. The Roman system of municipal government was in many ways a miniature version of the Roman Republic itself, with elected magistrates, a deliberative council, and a formal apparatus of law and administration. The highest magistrates of Pompeii were the duoviri, the two men, who served as the equivalent of consuls, presiding over the council, conducting elections, and representing the city in its dealings with the Roman provincial authorities. Elections were a serious business in Pompeii, as the remarkable collection of electoral notices painted on the city's walls attests. These painted notices, known as programmata, were one of the most distinctive features of Pompeii's streetscapes. They covered the facades of buildings throughout the city, painted in red and black letters by professional sign painters on the white plastered walls, recommending candidates for the various municipal offices. They are among the most vivid testimonials to Roman democratic culture that survive anywhere, and they are full of surprises. The candidates are endorsed not just by individuals but by groups: the fruit sellers, the goldsmiths, the carriers of sedan chairs, the devotees of a particular inn. Women's names appear as endorsers, a reminder that even in a society where women could not vote or hold office, they were clearly participants in the informal political life of the community. Some notices have a sardonic humor. One recommends a candidate for aedile on the grounds that he is a good sleeper, and that even the laziest people support him. Below the decurions in the social hierarchy were the ordinary free citizens of Pompeii, the plebs, a category that encompassed an enormous range of economic circumstances and social positions. At the upper end were the successful craftsmen and shopkeepers who had built comfortable lives for themselves through their own labor and ingenuity. At the lower end were the urban poor, the day laborers and casual workers who scraped by on whatever they could earn in the markets and workshops and docks of the city. This middling population of free artisans and traders was the backbone of Pompeii's economic life, and the evidence of their work is everywhere in the city. The workshops of Pompeii have been excavated in extraordinary detail. Bakeries, with their large stone mills for grinding grain and their domed ovens for baking bread, are among the most completely preserved. Pompeii had at least 33 bakeries at the time of the eruption, some of them small neighborhood establishments, and others large commercial operations capable of supplying bread to dozens or hundreds of customers daily. In one bakery, the oven still contained carbonized loaves of bread, preserved by the very heat and ash that destroyed the city. Round, flat loaves divided into segments like modern rolls, with the bakery's stamp impressed into the top. In another bakery, the millstones still stand in position, rotated by donkeys or slaves, grinding the grain into flour that would be mixed with water, kneaded, left to rise, and then slid into the hot oven on a long-handled paddle. The fulleries, establishments for washing and processing cloth, are another distinctive feature of Pompeii's commercial landscape. The Fullonica of Stephanus, named for the man whose name was found inscribed above its entrance, occupies a large townhouse that was converted from domestic to commercial use sometime before the eruption. The conversion involved the installation of large vats in what had once been elegant reception rooms, vats in which cloth was soaked in solutions of water, urine, and fuller's earth, then trampled by workers who stood in the vats and worked the cloth with their feet. Urine was a valuable commodity in the Roman world because of its ammonia content, which made it an effective cleaning and bleaching agent, and fullers collected it from street-side pots placed outside their establishments for passers-by to use. The smell must have been remarkable. Beside the vats of Stephanus's fullery, the archaeologists found a large mosaic depicting the various stages of the fulling process, a commercial advertisement, and a technical diagram at the same time. Among the most intriguing of Pompeii's social figures are the freedmen. Roman slavery was not a permanent condition in the way that race-based slavery in the modern world has been. Romans regularly freed their slaves, either out of affection, as a reward for loyal service, or as a calculated commercial strategy, since a freed slave who continued to work in his former master's business had a stronger incentive to succeed than an enslaved worker. When freed, a former slave took the family name of his former master and became a full Roman citizen, though with some legal restrictions in the first generation. Many of the most successful businessmen in Pompeii were freedmen or the descendants of freedmen, men who had clawed their way up from the bottom of the social ladder through a combination of ability, industry, and the particular opportunities that the Roman system offered. The most famous of Pompeii's freedmen is a fictional one, but a fictional one based on real social conditions. Trimalchio, the magnificent vulgarian at the center of Petronius's Satyricon, is widely believed to have been inspired by the nouveau rich freedmen of Campania, men who had made fortunes in trade and manufacturing, and who expressed their newly acquired wealth with a sometimes grotesque excess that the older aristocracy found deeply amusing and slightly alarming. Trimalchio's dinner party, in which course after course of increasingly elaborate food is served to increasingly bewildered guests, is one of the great satirical set pieces of ancient literature, but it is also a precise sociological document of the world it describes. In Pompeii itself, the evidence of freedmen's prominence is everywhere. Many of the largest and most elaborately decorated houses in the city appear to have belonged to freedmen or their descendants. The great house of the Vetii, perhaps the most completely preserved and lavishly painted private house in Pompeii, was owned by two brothers, Aulus Vettius Restitutus and Aulus Vettius Conviva, whose names suggest freedman origin. Their house, a showcase of sophisticated taste and considerable wealth, contained some of the most remarkable wall paintings in Pompeii, including a famous series of cupids engaged in various adult occupations: metallurgy, chariot racing, perfume making, depicted with a combination of whimsy and technical precision that perfectly embodies the culture of the Roman high imperial period. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, and forming a very substantial part of the city's population, were the slaves. The Roman economy was a slave economy in a fundamental sense. The labor that made Roman prosperity possible was overwhelmingly unfree labor. In a household of any pretension, domestic service of all kinds was performed by slaves. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, personal attendance, secretarial work, accountancy. In the workshops and commercial establishments of the city, skilled and unskilled labor alike was often performed by enslaved workers. On the agricultural estates of the surrounding countryside, gangs of slaves worked the fields and vineyards under the supervision of a villicus, a slave manager who was himself enslaved. The number of slaves in Pompeii is impossible to determine with precision. Estimates range widely, but it is generally thought that slaves may have constituted somewhere between a quarter and a third of the total population. This means that at any given time in the streets of Pompeii, a substantial minority of the people you might encounter were legally property, human beings who could be bought and sold, beaten, sexually exploited, and worked to death without any legal recourse. This is not a comfortable fact to sit with, and the scale of it tends to fade in the excitement of archaeological discovery, the beautiful mosaics and the witty graffiti, and the preserved loaves of bread. But the reality of slavery is present everywhere in Pompeii too, in the tiny cubicles at the back of houses that were the sleeping quarters of domestic slaves, in the collar with a name tag that was sometimes attached to a slave, as one might attach a luggage label, in the iron shackles found in some properties that were used to restrain recalcitrant workers. The women of Pompeii occupy a complex position in the historical record. Roman law gave women very few formal rights. They could not vote, could not hold public office, could not enter into legal contracts without a male guardian, and were expected to be subject first to their fathers and then to their husbands. In practice, however, the social reality was considerably more nuanced. Wealthy Roman women exercised considerable informal power through their control of domestic affairs, their influence over husbands and sons, and their participation in the religious life of the community. The women of Pompeii appear in the electoral notices as active political actors, endorsing candidates and presumably exerting pressure on the men in their lives to vote accordingly. They appear in the paintings and mosaics of the city, not just as objects of male desire, but as independent figures engaged in their own activities, reading, playing musical instruments, conducting sacrifices, managing businesses. The graffiti of Pompeii, that extraordinary collection of informal writing scratched or painted on walls throughout the city, bring the people of Pompeii to life in the most immediate and sometimes shocking way. There are more than 11,000 pieces of graffiti recorded from Pompeii, covering every aspect of human experience. There are declarations of love. I love Restituta and I beg her to love me back. There are insults. Lucius Isticidius is a thief. There are philosophical observations. Nothing can last forever. There are advertisements for gladiatorial shows, lists of names, fragments of poetry, including lines from Virgil's Aeneid that someone clearly knew by heart and scratched on a wall as one might today scribble a lyric that has been running through one's head. There are the names of travelers who slept in particular inns and wanted to record their passage, the equivalent of signing a guest book. There are the names of people who simply wanted to say, "I was here, I existed, I passed through this place and left my mark." Among the most poignant graffiti in Pompeii are the simpler ones, the ones that need no interpretation. A child's handprints pressed into wet plaster, the names of lovers written side by side, a single word scratched deep into a wall. Veil, farewell. Chapter 4. Eating, drinking, and the business of pleasure. The Romans were, by any measure, a people who took food and drink seriously, and Pompeii was a city where the business of eating and drinking was conducted with remarkable efficiency and variety. To understand daily life in Pompeii is to understand that the modern concept of the home as a place of private cooking and family meals was largely absent from the ancient city. Most Pompeians did not cook at home. Most of them, in fact, did not have kitchens. This is one of the facts about ancient Roman urban life that surprises modern visitors most consistently. The typical dwelling in Pompeii, the small apartment or single rented room that housed the majority of the city's population, had no cooking facilities beyond perhaps a small brazier for boiling water or warming leftovers. The streets of Pompeii were therefore lined with an extraordinary density of eating and drinking establishments, places where the working population could buy cooked food, warm drinks, and the rough local wine that was the standard beverage of ordinary Roman life. These establishments are called thermopolia in modern archaeological literature, from the Greek words for hot things for sale, though the Romans themselves had a variety of terms for different types of eating establishments. A thermopolium was identified by its distinctive architectural feature, a masonry counter, roughly L-shaped or straight, with large ceramic dolia, storage jars, sunk into the counter's surface. These jars held the food, kept warm by the heat of the counter, and sometimes by charcoal braziers set into the counter itself. Pompeii had at least 158 thermopolia at the time of the eruption, a remarkable density for a city of its size, and more may remain to be excavated in the unexcavated portion of the city. The food served in these establishments was the food of ordinary Roman life. Stews of legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans, dishes of vegetables cooked with oil and garum, bread either purchased fresh from the baker next door or provided by the thermopolium itself, olives marinated in oil and herbs, dried fruits and nuts, on special occasions or in more prosperous establishments, cuts of meat, pork, beef, or poultry cooked over the fire. Wine was always available, diluted with water as was the Roman custom, sometimes flavored with honey or spices, sometimes heated in the winter months. A complete meal at a thermopolium might cost a few copper asses, the smallest denomination of Roman coinage, making it accessible even to the poorest free residents of the city. In recent years, excavations in the Regio V area of Pompeii have uncovered a particularly well-preserved thermopolium that has provided extraordinary insights into the food served in these establishments. Analysis of the residues in the dolia revealed remains of duck, pig, goat, fish, snails, and various grains and legumes. The paintings on the counter depicted ducks and other animals, suggesting that the imagery of the painted decoration was connected to the actual menu of the establishment. On the counter, when excavated, were found the remains of a duck stew, the bones still in the cooking vessel, as if the last meal prepared before the eruption had simply been abandoned mid-preparation. Above and beyond the thermopolium, Pompeii had a range of other food-related establishments. The Caupani were something like inns, offering food and drink, but also accommodation for travelers and local residents, who for one reason or another needed a bed for the night. They had a somewhat rough reputation. The Roman upper classes regarded Pompeii as dens of vice and drunkenness, which was probably not entirely unfair. The Pompeii were the drinking establishments of the city, places where wine and simple food were available, and where dice games and other gambling activities provided entertainment that shaded into illegality. The tabernae were shops of all kinds, but many of them specialized in wine, sold by the amphora or the cup from their street-facing counters. The gardens and market stalls of Pompeii supplied the raw ingredients for all this cooking. The city had several market areas, including the Macelum, the large covered market hall adjacent to the Forum, where fish, meat, and other perishables were sold. The Macelum was built in the early imperial period and was one of the most impressive commercial buildings in Pompeii, with a colonnaded courtyard and a central circular structure, the Tholos, which may have been a fish market with running water. Around the walls of the Macelum, food sellers rented small booths from which they plied their trade. The stalls of the money changers and purveyors of religious offerings were also located in the Forum area near the Macelum, since buying food for a feast and making an offering to the gods were often connected activities in the Roman calendar. The production of garum, the fish sauce that was both Pompeii's most distinctive product and one of the fundamental seasonings of all Roman cooking, was a major industry in and around the city. Garum was made by layering fish, usually anchovies or mackerel or a mixture of small fish, with salt in large containers and leaving the mixture to ferment under the Mediterranean sun. After weeks or months of fermentation, the liquid that drained from the bottom of the containers was the precious garum, a dark, pungent, protein-rich sauce that was used in Roman cooking, something like soy sauce or Worcestershire sauce today, as a universal seasoning that enhanced the flavor of almost everything. The production of garum was smelly and unpleasant, which is why the large-scale garum factories were located outside the city limits or in areas near the harbor, but smaller quantities were also produced in some urban workshops. The Pompeian garum trade was dominated by a relatively small number of wealthy merchants whose names appear on the amphorae that contained their products. The most prominent was Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, whose large house in the western part of the city was decorated with mosaics depicting garum amphorae, inscribed with his brand and advertising slogans. Scaurus was clearly a man who was not ashamed of the source of his wealth, and his house, though not architecturally the most impressive in Pompeii, contains one of the most direct statements of commercial identity that survives from the ancient world. Beyond eating and drinking, Pompeii offered its residents and visitors a full range of what the Romans considered necessary pleasures. The baths have already been mentioned as social institutions, but their role in daily life deserves more detailed consideration. For most Pompeians, the public baths were the only place where they could bathe with any regularity, since the private houses of ordinary citizens had no bathing facilities. The baths opened in the early afternoon, after the main business of the day was done, and many Pompeians would have visited every day or every other day. The price of admission was low, a few coins at most, and children were often admitted free. The bathing sequence moved from the cold room through the warm room to the hot room, with bathers receiving rubs with olive oil and scraping of the skin with the strigil, the curved metal scraper that served as the Roman equivalent of a washcloth, from the hands of bath attendants or from friends or their own slaves. The conversation in the baths must have been remarkable, a constant buzz of gossip, argument, political discussion, and social performance. The baths were one of the places where the barriers of social class could be momentarily and partially dissolved, where a wealthy merchant might find himself sweating beside a craftsman, where news was exchanged and rumors amplified and deals struck. Seneca, who lived above a public bath at one point in his life and complained bitterly about the noise, has left us a vivid description of the soundscape. The grunt of the weightlifter, the slap of the masseuse's hands on a customer's back, the shriek of someone having his armpits depilated with tweezers, the shouts of the pastry seller and the sausage seller, and the lemonade seller who plied their trade in and around the bathing halls. Sex was another form of commerce in Pompeii, and the city's brothels were busy places. The most completely preserved brothel in Pompeii, known as the Luminaire, occupies a small building near the center of the city and consisted of 10 tiny rooms arranged over 2 floors. The rooms on the ground floor each had a masonry bed with a low stone mattress base, a simple oil lamp niche, and above the doorway, a painted panel depicting a sexual scene that probably advertised the specialties available within. The upper floor, accessible by a separate wooden staircase from the street, probably served a slightly more upscale clientele. The walls of the Luminaire are covered with graffiti, some obscene, some strangely tender, some simply recording names and prices and services rendered. The sexuality of Pompeii is a subject that has alternately fascinated and embarrassed scholars and visitors since the city was first excavated. The sheer quantity of erotic imagery in the city, on walls, on lamps, on jewelry, on cooking pots, on amulets worn around the neck, is striking by any standard. Phallic symbols appear everywhere as apotropaic charms, protections against the evil eye, images of good luck. The explicit sexual scenes in the changing rooms of the baths are thought by some scholars to have served as a kind of memory aid, helping patrons remember which cubicle they had left their clothes in. The erotic paintings in dining rooms were presumably intended as entertainment for the guests at dinner parties, conversation starters, perhaps, or simply visual pleasures in a culture that had a considerably more relaxed attitude toward explicit sexual imagery in public spaces than most modern societies. Chapter 5. Gods, temples, and the sacred life of the city. The Romans were, in the words of the ancient writer Livy, the most religious people in the world, and while modern scholars might debate the precise meaning of Roman religiosity, there is no question that the sacred and the profane were more thoroughly interwoven in Roman daily life than most modern Western societies would find comfortable. The gods were everywhere in Pompeii, in the temples of the Forum, in the household shrines of private homes, in the street corner shrines where passers-by stopped to make a quick offering, in the paintings on walls and the images on everyday objects. Religion was not a Sunday morning affair. It was a continuous presence, a constant negotiation between human beings and the divine powers that governed the world. The most important public temples of Pompeii stood in or near the Forum, the civic heart of the city. The temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the Capitoline Triad who were the supreme gods of the Roman state religion, occupied the most prestigious position in the Forum, at its northern end on a high podium from which it dominated the entire space. The temple was built in the Sullan period, replacing an earlier structure, and it was modeled on the great Capitoline Temple in Rome itself, a deliberate architectural statement of Pompeii's identity as a Roman city. Its columns were Corinthian, its pediment was decorated with painted terracotta statuary, and within its cella stood the cult statues of the 3 gods, larger than life and shown in their divine majesty. Beside the Forum, slightly to one side, stood the Temple of Apollo, one of the oldest sacred sites in Pompeii, with origins going back to at least the 6th century before the Common Era. Apollo was a god of many attributes in the Roman world, the god of the sun and of light, of music and poetry, of prophecy and healing, of archery and the plague. His temple in Pompeii was built on the Greek model, surrounded by a colonnade of Doric columns on the outside, and set within a larger precinct wall that separated it from the surrounding streets. In the precinct stood a bronze statue of Apollo himself, poised to shoot an arrow, and across from it a statue of Diana, his twin sister. The sundial in the precinct, set on a column, marked the hours of the day for citizens who had no other way to tell the time. Around the temple precinct, the walls were painted with elaborate mythological scenes that have now largely faded or been lost, but which must have made the space extraordinarily vivid and alive. The Temple of Venus, Pompeii's patron deity, stood on the southwestern edge of the city, on a promontory overlooking the sea and the bay. Venus was a goddess of love and beauty, of course, but in the Roman world she was also a goddess of the sea, of luck and good fortune, of military victory, and of the Julian family from which the emperors of Rome claimed divine descent. As the patron goddess of the city, Venus had a special relationship with Pompeii that went beyond the ordinary devotion that any Roman city owed to its tutelary deity. The Pompeians celebrated her festival with particular enthusiasm, and her image appeared throughout the city, on walls, on amulets, on the lids of containers, on the pottery used in everyday life. But the most fascinating temple in Pompeii, the one that speaks most directly to the religious complexity of the Roman imperial world, is the Temple of Isis. Isis was an Egyptian goddess, the great mother goddess of the Nile, the divine healer, the mistress of magic, the patron of sailors, and the protector of the dead. Her cult had spread throughout the Hellenistic world in the centuries following Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt. And by the 1st century of the Common Era, it was one of the most widely followed mystery religions in the Roman Empire. The appeal of Isis was manifold. Her mythology was extraordinarily rich and emotionally resonant, featuring the death and resurrection of her husband Osiris and her devoted search for his scattered body. Her rites offered initiation into mysteries that promised a blessed afterlife, and her image as a tender, compassionate mother goddess who suckled the child Horus prefigured in striking ways the imagery of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child that would become central to early Christian art. The Temple of Isis in Pompeii was completely rebuilt after the earthquake of 62, as an inscription tells us, by Numerius Papidius Celsinus, who donated the entire cost of reconstruction in the name of his 6-year-old son Numerius Papidius Ampliatus, presumably to gain the child a seat on the local council. The rebuilt temple was lavishly decorated with wall paintings depicting scenes from Egyptian mythology, statues of Egyptian gods and their animal-headed manifestations, and ritual equipment for the elaborate ceremonies that were central to Isis worship. The discovery of the Temple of Isis in 1765 caused a sensation in European cultural life, sparking a wave of Egyptomania that influenced everything from the decoration of Wedgwood pottery to Mozart's opera The Magic Flute. Beyond the major temples, religion permeated every corner of Pompeian life. The lararium, the household shrine, was found in virtually every house and shop in Pompeii. These shrines, typically painted on a wall in a prominent position in the atrium or near the kitchen, depicted the Lares, the protective spirits of the household, as two dancing figures pouring libations from drinking horns, flanking a central figure of the genius, the creative spirit of the paterfamilias. Below these divine figures, a serpent, symbol of the earth's fertility and protective power, moved through a painted garden. Before these shrines, the family would make daily offerings of food, incense, and wine, asking for the protection and blessing of the household gods on the day's activities. Street shrines, shrines to the Lares Compitals, the guardian spirits of the crossroads, were placed at major intersections throughout the city. These were public shrines maintained by the neighborhood associations, the collegia, that were one of the basic units of Roman social organization. The crossroads shrines were decorated with paintings and received offerings from the residents of the surrounding neighborhood. They were points of communal gathering, places where the threads of neighborhood life were woven together through shared religious practice. The emperor, too, demanded worship, or at least a form of devotion that stopped just short of what the Romans considered proper worship. The imperial cult, the veneration of the divine essence or genius of the living emperor, and the full divine status accorded to deceased emperors, was one of the most important religious innovations of the Roman imperial period. Temples to the imperial cult were built in every city of the empire, including Pompeii, where the building of Eumatia, a large structure on the eastern side of the Forum built by a wealthy priestess of Venus named Eumatia, was dedicated to Concordia and Pietas, virtues associated with the imperial house, and may have served in part as a center for the wool trade, and in part as a venue for the activities of the Fullers' Guild, which erected a statue of Eumatia in her honor. The relationship between commerce and religion in the Roman world was often seamlessly intertwined. The religion of Pompeii was not, however, always a matter of official temples and state cults. The city was home to a remarkable variety of religious practices, many of them quite different from the mainstream Roman tradition. Evidence of Jewish residence has been found in the form of a Hebrew inscription. Christian activity in Pompeii before the eruption is a matter of scholarly debate. A cross-shaped mark on a wall in the House of the Bicentenary has been interpreted by some as an early Christian symbol, though the interpretation is contested. What is clear is that Pompeii, like all port cities, was a cosmopolitan place where people of many different cultural and religious backgrounds lived and worked side by side, each bringing their own religious traditions and practices to the city. Chapter 6. The Spectacles. Gladiators, theater, and public entertainment. If the Romans were serious about religion, they were equally serious about entertainment. The provision of public spectacles was one of the fundamental obligations of Roman civic life, an obligation that fell on the wealthy and politically ambitious members of society, who were expected to fund theatrical performances, gladiatorial games, beast hunts, and other public shows as a means of winning popular favor and discharging their duty to the community. Pompeii, for a city of its size, had an impressive infrastructure for public entertainment, and the evidence of the city's enthusiasm for spectacle is one of the most vivid aspects of its material culture. The amphitheater of Pompeii is one of the oldest surviving amphitheaters in the Roman world, built around 70 before the Common Era during the Sullan period and still standing, largely intact, 2,000 years later. It is a relatively modest structure by the standards of the Colosseum in Rome, but it was perfectly adequate for the needs of a city of Pompeii's size, capable of holding perhaps 20,000 spectators, possibly the entire population of the city and some visitors from surrounding towns as well. The amphitheater was built in the southeastern corner of the city, taking advantage of the natural slope of the ground to provide the lower tiers of seating, with only the upper tiers requiring the construction of earthen embankments to achieve the necessary height. The gladiatorial games, the munera, held in this amphitheater were the defining public spectacle of Roman life. The gladiators who fought here were not free citizens doing their civic duty. They were, for the most part, slaves, condemned criminals, or free men who had voluntarily submitted to the brutal discipline of the gladiatorial school in exchange for the small chance of winning fame, freedom, and perhaps even wealth. The gladiatorial school, the ludus, where fighters were trained, fed, and housed, was located near the amphitheater in a large building with a central practice area surrounded by small cells where the fighters lived. When this building was excavated in the 18th century, the excavators found the skeletons of 18 people, including one woman wearing elaborate gold jewelry, who had apparently sought shelter there from the eruption and had not escaped. The gladiators of Pompeii were famous throughout the region, and their exploits were celebrated on the walls of the city in elaborate painted advertisements that announced upcoming shows. These advertisements, the painted versions of what a modern promoter might put on a billboard, gave the names of the fighters, their records of victories and defeats, the date and venue of the show, and sometimes additional details about the entertainment on offer, including beast hunts and the distribution of bread or gifts to the crowd. One remarkable example advertises 20 pairs of gladiators of Decimus Lucretius Satrius Valens, priest of Nero Caesar, son of Augustus forever, and 10 pairs of gladiators of his son Decimus Lucretius Valens will fight at Pompeii on April 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There will also be a wild beast hunt, appropriate stage machinery, and an awning. The presence of the awning, the velarium, was an important amenity at Pompeian shows. The amphitheater had no permanent roof. It was open to the sky, which was fine in the mild Campanian climate for much of the year, but could be brutally hot in summer. The velarium was a great canopy of sailcloth strung on ropes attached to wooden poles around the upper rim of the structure, and it provided shade for the spectators below. The men of the naval squadron at Misenum were often detailed to erect and manage the velarium at Roman amphitheaters, a task that required considerable skill in handling large quantities of canvas and rigging. The spectators in the amphitheater were seated according to social rank, as Roman custom dictated. The best seats, at the lowest level closest to the action, were reserved for the decurions and other notables. Women and slaves sat at the very top, in the cheapest and most uncomfortable seats. The different social groups entered and exited through different gates, a system designed both to manage the crowd efficiently and to maintain the visible distinctions of rank that were central to the Roman social order. But gladiatorial spectacles were not the only form of public entertainment in Pompeii. The city had two theaters, a large open-air theater capable of holding perhaps 5,000 spectators and a smaller covered theater, the Odeon, which seated about 1,500 and was used for more intimate performances, musical recitals, mimes, dramatic readings, and perhaps puppet shows. The large theater was built in the Samnite period, rebuilt and extended in the Roman period, and was the setting for performances of Latin comedy and tragedy, for the spectacular pantomime performances that were the most popular dramatic form of the early imperial period, and perhaps for gladiatorial fights or animal hunts on special occasions when the amphitheater was not available. Pantomime, a Roman art form quite different from the English Christmas tradition that bears the same name, was perhaps the dominant theatrical genre of Pompeii's last century. The Roman pantomimist was a solo performer, masked and costumed, who danced and mimed the parts of mythological figures to the accompaniment of music and a chorus. The great pantomime stars of the imperial period were genuine celebrities, adored by crowds throughout the empire, the subject of obsessive fan culture, not unlike the devotion that modern audiences bestow on film stars or pop musicians. The walls of Pompeii bear graffiti expressing love and admiration for famous pantomime performers, and there is evidence of organized fan clubs, sodalicia, who followed their favorite performers and sometimes engaged in violent conflicts with the supporters of rival stars. One of the most famous incidents in Pompeii's history involved exactly this kind of theatrical rivalry. In 59 of the Common Era, just 2 decades before the eruption, a gladiatorial show at the amphitheater turned into a riot between the Pompeians and visitors from the neighboring town of Nuceria. The fight began with insults and taunts, escalated to throwing stones, and ended with drawn weapons. When the violence was over, many people were dead or seriously injured, and there was an international incident, since Nuceria was a Roman colony with political connections to the imperial center. The Roman Senate, acting on the complaint of the Nucerians, banned Pompeii from holding gladiatorial games for 10 years, a punishment that must have been felt as a severe blow to civic pride. The incident was immortalized in a wall painting found in a private house in Pompeii, showing the fighting inside and outside the amphitheater in vivid, almost journalistic detail. The Palestra, the large exercise ground adjacent to the amphitheater, was another important venue for public life. Roman ideas about physical fitness were complex. The proper cultivation of the male body was seen as both personally virtuous and socially beneficial, and the Palestra provided a space for the various forms of athletic training that were part of Roman masculine culture. Wrestling, boxing, and various throwing events were practiced here. The large swimming pool in the center of the Palestra must have been particularly welcome in the summer heat. Young men of the better families trained here under the supervision of instructors, preparing their bodies for the physical demands of military service, which was still in theory the defining obligation of the Roman male citizen. Chapter 7. Art and beauty in a Roman city, Pompeii is, among many other things, one of the greatest art museums in the world and the most unusual because its collection was never assembled by curators or purchased at auction. It grew organically over centuries through the decisions of thousands of individual Pompeians about how to decorate their homes and public spaces. And it was preserved not by the care of conservation specialists, but by the catastrophic violence of a volcanic eruption. The result is a collection of ancient paintings, mosaics, sculpture, and decorative arts that is unmatched anywhere in the world for its completeness, its variety, and its vividness. The wall paintings of Pompeii are the most famous element of this collection. Roman wall painting was a major art form throughout the ancient world, practiced with great technical skill and artistic ambition. But Pompeii is one of the very few places where it survives in sufficient quantity and quality to allow a real understanding of what Roman interiors looked like. Elsewhere, the paintings have long since faded and flaked and crumbled. In Pompeii, sealed under volcanic debris, they survived for nearly 2,000 years in conditions of remarkable preservation, their colors still vivid, their compositions still legible, their subjects still identifiable. Scholars have identified 4 successive styles of Pompeian wall painting, conventionally numbered 1st through 4th, which together span roughly 3 centuries, from about the 2nd century before the Common Era to the date of the eruption. The first style was the oldest, and the most architecturally conservative. It attempted to create the illusion of expensive marble wall cladding through the use of paint and plaster modeling. Thick, horizontal bands of painted plaster mimicked the appearance of colored marble panels, the kind of luxurious stone facing that only the very wealthy could afford in reality. This was decoration as a form of flattery to the viewer, an assertion that the house's owner had, at least aesthetically, the same tastes as the great marble palaces of the Hellenistic world. The second style, which flourished from roughly 80 before the Common Era to the beginning of the Imperial period, was far more ambitious. Where the first style had created an illusion of rich materials, the second style created an illusion of space. Painters of the second style used the principles of perspective and foreshortening to create the impression that the walls of the room dissolved into 3-dimensional architecture. Colonnades, balconies, garden views, whole imaginary buildings seen through windows or doorways that opened in the painted wall surface. The best examples of this style, such as the Great Frieze from the Villa of the Mysteries on the outskirts of Pompeii, have a spatial complexity and a painterly confidence that rival anything produced in Western art until the Renaissance. The Villa of the Mysteries frieze deserves special attention. Running around 3 walls of a large room in a villa just outside the Herculaneum Gate, it depicts, in life-size figures, a sequence of scenes that are almost certainly connected to the Dionysiac mystery cult. The scene shows a series of figures, mostly women, engaged in activities that appear to be ritual in nature. Reading from a scroll, mixing liquids in a vessel, carrying objects, being flogged by a winged figure dancing. The mood is intense, ceremonial, slightly menacing. The figures are painted with extraordinary psychological depth. Their faces express fear, anticipation, concentration, ecstasy. The fresco is one of the great paintings of antiquity, comparable in ambition and execution to the best works of the Renaissance. And its subject matter, whatever it precisely means, clearly engaged a deep level of religious and emotional experience. The third style, which dominated the Augustan and Julio-Claudian periods, roughly from 20 before the Common Era to around 50 of the Common Era, turned away from the illusionistic spatial complexity of the second style and toward a more decorative, flat, almost Egyptian aesthetics. The walls were divided into large, single-color panels of red, black, white, or yellow, and these panels were decorated with delicate, fantastic architectural fantasies, slender columns supporting impossible canopies, intricate geometric ornaments, small mythological scenes in the center of the main panels, painted as if they were framed pictures hung on the wall. The third style is at once more precious and more intimate than the second, the decoration of a culture that has achieved enough security to prefer elegance over ambition. The fourth style, which is the dominant style in Pompeii at the time of the eruption, combined elements of all three previous styles in a sometimes exuberant, sometimes frenetic mix. It revived the three-dimensional architectural fantasies of the second style, but pushed them to even greater complexity and improbability, creating walls that seemed to dissolve into intricate stage sets of columns, arches, pavilions, and deep perspective vistas. It incorporated the mythological panels of the third style, expanding them and giving the mythological figures a new energy and expressiveness. And it added entirely new elements, large-scale mythological narrative scenes that took up entire wall panels, depicted with the spatial complexity and psychological immediacy of a theatrical performance caught at a dramatic moment. The mythological subjects of fourth-style painting are drawn from the full range of Greek and Roman mythology. The loves and wars of the gods, the adventures of heroes, the tragedies of mortal men and women caught in the machinery of divine will. Perseus rescuing Andromeda from the sea monster, Narcissus gazing at his reflection in the pool, Ariadne abandoned by Theseus on the beach at Naxos, about to be consoled by Dionysus, Hercules finding his son Telephus being suckled by a doe, the judgment of Paris, the death of Actaeon. These scenes were not mere decoration. They were statements about the cultural sophistication of the homeowner, evidence of participation in the shared mythological culture of the Greco-Roman world. To have a painting of Perseus and Andromeda in your dining room was to situate yourself within a tradition of educated refinement that stretched from Homer to the present day. The mosaics of Pompeii are, if anything, even more technically accomplished than the paintings. Roman mosaic was an art that required extraordinary patience and skill, the cutting and laying of thousands of tiny tesserae, cubes of colored stone, glass, terracotta, or shell, to create images of great complexity and beauty. The floors of the most prosperous Pompeian houses were laid with elaborate mosaic carpets that combined geometric borders with figural panels of remarkable artistic quality. The Alexander mosaic from the House of the Faun, already mentioned, was the most ambitious of these floor mosaics, but it was far from the only one. Dining rooms were often decorated with images of food scraps under the table, a genre known as the asarotos oikos, the unswept room, an ancient trompe l'oeil that depicted with hyperrealistic precision the debris of a dinner party. Fish bones, nutshells, grape stems, fruit rinds, all rendered in tiny fragments of colored stone. The sculpture of Pompeii was largely derivative of Greek originals, as was much Roman sculpture, but it filled the public and private spaces of the city with a constant presence of the divine and the human in idealized form. Garden statues of nymphs and satyrs, of Dionysus and Venus and Hercules, stood among the fountains and flower beds of the larger houses. Bronze statues of victorious athletes and divine figures decorated the temple precincts and the forum. Herms, the pillar-like figures with a human head and genitalia that marked boundaries and protected doorways, stood at entrances throughout the city. Chapter 8. Letters, Literature, and the Life of the Mind. Pompeii was not Rome, and it was not Athens. It was a prosperous provincial town, not a center of high culture or philosophical inquiry. But it was not an intellectual desert either. The evidence from Pompeii suggests a level of literacy that may surprise those accustomed to thinking of the ancient world as primarily oral. The 11,000 pieces of graffiti on its walls, the painted electoral notices, the commercial inscriptions, the carefully maintained accounts in the business records found in several establishments, all testify to a population in which basic literacy was remarkably widespread, extending far below the educated elite to include artisans, traders, freedmen, and even, in some cases, slaves. The school at Pompeii has left its traces. In one house, a set of children's writing exercises was found preserved on a wax tablet, the equivalent of a school notebook. The wax tablets, flat wooden boards coated with beeswax, were the standard writing medium for everyday use in the Roman world. Text was scratched into the wax with a metal stylus and could be erased by smoothing the wax with the flat end of the stylus. For more permanent records, ink was written on papyrus or parchment. In Pompeii, a number of carbonized papyrus rolls have been found, including the extraordinary library of the Villa of the Papyri at nearby Herculaneum, which contained hundreds of Greek and Latin philosophical texts. The texts quoted in Pompeii's graffiti reveal the literary education of at least some of the city's inhabitants. Verses from Virgil's Aeneid, the great national epic of Rome, appear on several walls, sometimes in full sentences, sometimes in isolated lines that were clearly remembered and reproduced from memory. Verses from Ovid, from Propertius, from earlier poets, appear less frequently but are present. Someone scratched a line from the Aeneid on the wall of the amphitheater. Another wrote a line of Ovid in the entrance passage of a house. These are not scholarly quotations. They are the traces of an education that had implanted these texts deeply enough in memory that they could be reproduced spontaneously, years after the formal schooling that had taught them was over. The houses of the wealthier Pompeians would have contained libraries of papyrus rolls, though these have not survived in the city itself as they have at Herculaneum. The educated Roman was expected to be familiar with a wide range of literary, philosophical, and historical texts, and the paintings and mosaics in Pompeian houses frequently reference this literary culture. The mythological scenes that fill the painted walls of the city are not random. They draw on a shared body of mythological narrative that was transmitted through both oral tradition and the literary tradition of epic and lyric poetry. To see the painting of Dido and Aeneas in a Pompeian dining room was to be reminded of the fourth book of Virgil's Aeneid, one of the most emotionally powerful pieces of Latin literature ever written, and the association enriched both the painting and the dinner party conversation. Beyond literature, the Romans were enthusiastic practitioners of mathematics, engineering, and practical science, and the evidence of these skills is everywhere in Pompeii. The lead water pipes that carried the aqueduct water through the city were stamped with the names of their manufacturers and the measurements of their internal diameter. The millstones in the bakeries were precisely shaped and balanced. The walls of buildings were constructed with a technical knowledge of load distribution that kept them standing for centuries. The hypocaust heating systems in the baths represented a sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics that would not be equaled in European technology for more than 1,000 years after Pompeii's destruction. Chapter 9. The Forum and Political Life. The Forum of Pompeii is the beating heart of the ancient city, the place where civic life was concentrated and conducted, where the gods were worshipped, business was transacted, justice was administered, and the community presented itself to itself in its most formal and impressive form. To stand in the Forum of Pompeii today is to stand in one of the most evocative spaces in the ancient world, a space that still communicates something of what it must have felt like to be a Pompeian citizen going about the business of daily life. The Forum was a large rectangular open space, roughly 142 meters long and 38 meters wide, surrounded on three sides by colonnaded porticos that gave it a formal, enclosed character. The paving of the Forum was of white travertine limestone, laid in large slabs that must have reflected the Italian sun with blinding brightness on a clear day. No wheeled vehicles were permitted in the Forum. Large stone blocks were placed across the entrance streets to prevent carts from entering, so the space was reserved for pedestrians, a rare luxury of silence and clean pavement in a city whose streets were otherwise crowded with traffic. At the northern end of the Forum, the Temple of Jupiter dominated the space. To the east of the Forum stood the Macelum, the covered market, the sanctuary of the city Lares, and the Temple of Vespasian, a building dedicated to the recently deified emperor and still under construction at the time of the eruption. To the west stood the Temple of Apollo and the Basilica, the large building that served as the city's courthouse and center of business transactions. The Basilica was one of the largest buildings in Pompeii, a long rectangular hall divided into nave and aisles by 2 rows of columns, with a raised tribunal platform at one end where the magistrates presided over legal proceedings. The building of Eumatia, already mentioned in the context of religion, occupied the entire eastern side of the forum and was one of the most impressive buildings in the complex. It was built in the early 1st century of the Common Era by the priestess Eumatia at her own expense and dedicated to pietas and concordia, virtues associated with the Augustan settlement. Its function is debated. It may have served as a headquarters for the Fullers' Guild, as an auction house for the cloth trade, or as a space for the activities of the imperial cult. Whatever its precise function, it was a magnificent building, its facade decorated with elaborate carved reliefs and set within a deep colonnaded portico. The political life of Pompeii was conducted through a system of elected magistracies and appointed councils that was, in theory, a miniature version of the Roman Republic. In practice, by the 1st century of the Common Era, the political autonomy of Pompeii, like that of all Italian municipalities, had been substantially circumscribed by the concentration of power in the hands of the emperor and his representatives. But local politics still mattered. The elections for the duoviary and the aediles were genuine contests, as the extraordinary density of electoral notices on the city's walls attests. The winners of these elections gained not only honor and prestige, but also the obligation to fund public entertainments and public works from their own resources, a system of civic obligation known as euergetism that was fundamental to how Roman cities maintained their public infrastructure. The decurions, the local council, met in the curia, a formal meeting hall on the eastern side of the forum. The curia was a relatively modest building from the outside, but was dignified within, with marble-clad walls and a raised platform for the senior members of the council. Here the business of the city was conducted. Decisions about public building and maintenance, the allocation of public land, the conduct of religious ceremonies, the resolution of disputes between citizens, the management of the city's public finances. The minutes of council meetings, the acta, were inscribed on bronze tablets and posted in public, a practice of administrative transparency that modern democracies might envy. Chapter 10. The earthquake of 62 and the years of rebuilding. The earthquake that struck Campania on February 5, 62 of the Common Era was one of the defining events in the history of Pompeii, not because it destroyed the city, which it did not, but because of what it set in motion. The earthquake was powerful enough to cause severe structural damage throughout the region. Contemporary sources, particularly Seneca, who devoted a section of his Naturals questions to the event, describe the collapse of buildings, the disruption of water supplies, the panic of the population, and the death of large numbers of sheep, apparently overcome by gases released from fissures in the earth. In Pompeii itself, the earthquake damaged many of the city's major public buildings and a large number of private houses. The response of Pompeii's population to this disaster was remarkably energetic. Almost immediately after the earthquake, building activity began throughout the city, and the scale of construction visible in the archaeological record suggests that the Pompeians invested very substantial resources in the reconstruction and improvement of their city over the following 17 years before the eruption. This is in itself a significant observation. A community that was retreating or despairing would not have undertaken such an extensive program of public and private building. The Pompeians, in the years after 62, were a community with confidence in its future. The earthquake was not, however, the end of seismic unrest in the region. Tremors continued throughout the years following 62, and there is evidence in the archaeological record of ongoing structural repairs to buildings that continued to be damaged by minor earthquakes. The water supply to the city, appears to have been disrupted at various points, perhaps because the movement of underground strata had damaged the aqueduct pipes. In the final months before the eruption of 79, some areas of the city seem to have been experiencing an intensification of seismic activity, a fact that Pliny the Younger, our main literary source for the eruption, confirms when he notes that tremors had been frequent in the days before the volcanic eruption. The significance of this ongoing seismic activity can only be understood in retrospect. To the Pompeians, earthquakes were explained by the ancient theory, attributed to the philosopher Epicurus, and transmitted through Lucretius's great philosophical poem De Rerum Natura, that underground caverns filled with trapped air sometimes collapsed, causing the ground above to shake. Others attributed earthquakes to the anger of Neptune, the god of the sea, who was also regarded as the lord of earthquakes, Poseidon Anasageos, the earth shaker, in his Greek manifestation. What no one in Pompeii, in 79 of the Common Era, understood was that the mountain overlooking their city was a volcano, that the earthquakes were caused by magma moving underground, and that the seismic unrest of the preceding years was a warning of the catastrophe to come. In the final years before the eruption, the reconstruction of Pompeii was still very much in progress. The Forum area was a construction site in many ways, with marble cladding being applied to buildings, statues being installed, new inscriptions being cut. Private houses throughout the city were being redecorated in the fourth style of painting, the walls being prepared, painted, decorated, and sometimes re-prepared and repainted in successive campaigns of work. The Central Baths, the most modern and ambitious bathing complex that Pompeii would ever have, were under construction near the center of the city, their walls rising from their foundations, but their vaulted ceilings not yet completed. The city was in a condition that archaeologists sometimes describe as a snapshot of incompleteness, a city caught in the middle of its own transformation. Chapter 11. The Summer of 79. The last days the summer of 79 of the Common Era was, by all available evidence, a perfectly ordinary summer in Pompeii. The grain harvest had been completed. The grapes on the vine-covered slopes of Vesuvius were ripening toward the autumn vintage. The streets were crowded with the usual traffic of merchants and craftsmen and travelers. The baths were open and busy. The thermopolia were serving their customers from the steaming pots set into their masonry counters. The city was alive with the sounds and smells and movements of ordinary Roman urban life. In the weeks before August 24, there had been tremors. This was not unusual. Tremors were a fact of life in Campania, had been for as long as anyone could remember, and the Pompeians had learned to live with them as one learns to live with any endemic risk. The tremors of the days immediately before the eruption may have been more frequent or more intense than usual, but there is no evidence that they caused any particular alarm or prompted any evacuation of the city. The water supply may have been affected. Some investigators have noted that the public fountains seem to have been turned off in the days before the eruption, perhaps because the movement of underground strata had disrupted the aqueduct pipes. But even this, if it was noticed, may have been attributed to routine maintenance rather than volcanic precursor activity. The eruption began on the morning of August 24, though some scholars have recently argued, on the basis of new archaeological evidence including food remains, coins, and fashion items that suggest a later date, that the eruption may actually have occurred in October or November rather than in August. The coins found in the pockets of some victims include issues that were not in circulation before September of 79. The food remains in some establishments include autumn fruits and vegetables rather than the summer produce you might expect in August. The clothing on some victims includes heavy woolen garments more appropriate to cooler weather. The debate continues among scholars, but for the purposes of this narrative, we will follow the traditional date of August 24, while noting that the question remains open. What is beyond dispute is the basic sequence of events once the eruption began. Vesuvius erupted with extraordinary violence, sending a column of ash, gas, and rock fragments shooting upward from the volcano's vent to a height of perhaps 30 kilometers. This column, which Pliny the Younger described as resembling a stone pine tree for its shape, its great vertical trunk topped by a spreading horizontal canopy, was driven by the enormous heat and pressure of the erupting gases, and was so dense with volcanic material that it blocked out the light of the sun over a vast area. The darkness that descended on Pompeii and the surrounding region must have been terrifying. A darkness not like the gradual dimming of a cloudy day, but sudden and absolute, as if someone had pulled a curtain across the sky. Pliny the Younger, who was at Misenum on the northern end of the Bay of Naples with his mother and his uncle Pliny the Elder, the great Roman naturalist and admiral of the fleet, left behind 2 letters addressed to the historian Tacitus that are the primary literary sources for the eruption. The letters were written some years after the event, in response to Tacitus's request for information about the death of Pliny the Elder, who sailed toward Pompeii to investigate the eruption and to rescue his friends from the catastrophe and died in the attempt. These letters are extraordinary documents, written in Pliny's clear, elegant Latin, combining the precision of a scientific observer with the emotional intensity of a survivor who has witnessed something almost beyond human language to describe. In his first letter, Pliny the Younger describes the appearance of the eruption column from Misenum, across the bay, and recounts how his uncle ordered boats prepared to sail toward the phenomenon, initially out of scientific curiosity, and then, when messages arrived from friends near Pompeii asking for help, with a specific rescue mission in mind, Pliny the Elder sailed with a quadrireme across the Bay of Naples toward Stabiae, a town south of Pompeii where one of his friends, Pomponianus, was waiting to be rescued. The wind carried them easily toward the disaster, but it was the same wind that would prevent them from sailing back. Pliny, the Elder, landed at Stabiae, attempted to calm his terrified hosts, ordered a bath and dinner in a demonstration of either remarkable composure or willful denial, and then lay down to sleep as the eruption intensified around them. Chapter 12. August 24, 79. The eruption at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon of that terrible day, the south side of Vesuvius tore apart. What had been building for thousands of years, the accumulation of pressure in the magma chamber beneath the mountain, found its release in a catastrophic explosion that sent millions of tons of volcanic material blasting upward through the vent at velocities that modern volcanologists estimate at hundreds of meters per second. The eruption column that formed above the mountain was what volcanologists now classify as a Plinian eruption, named with appropriate historical irony after Pliny the Elder himself, who died in it. A Plinian eruption column works on a specific physical principle. The erupting mixture of gas, ash, and rock fragments is propelled upward by the enormous thermal energy of the eruption, and as long as the column continues to receive this thermal energy, it continues to rise. The column above Vesuvius on August 24 rose to a height of perhaps 25 to 30 kilometers, reaching the stratosphere. At these heights, the column spread horizontally in the characteristic pine tree shape that Pliny the Younger described, and the material falling from this canopy began to shower down on the lands below. The material that fell on Pompeii was primarily pumice, the light, porous volcanic rock that forms when lava is quickly cooled, and its dissolved gases escape as bubbles, leaving behind a stone full of tiny holes. Pompeian pumice was light enough to float on water, and it fell from the sky like a particularly heavy hailstorm, each stone ranging from the size of a pea to the size of a fist, accumulating on rooftops, in streets, in courtyards. In the first hours of the eruption, the pumice fall was the primary hazard for Pompeii's inhabitants. The buildings of the city could withstand the weight of pumice accumulation for a while, but as the material piled up on the roofs, the structural loads became dangerous, and eventually buildings began to collapse under the weight. The people of Pompeii responded to the eruption in different ways. Many fled immediately, taking with them what they could carry, some money, some jewelry, some food, the household gods in their little portable containers. The roads leading south and east out of the city, away from the volcano, were presumably crowded with refugees in the first hours of the eruption. Others chose to shelter in place, perhaps hoping that the worst would pass, perhaps unable or unwilling to abandon their property and possessions. Some were caught in the buildings themselves as the roofs began to collapse under the weight of the pumice. The darkness was total. Even in the middle of the afternoon, with the summer sun still high above the horizon, the sky was black with volcanic debris. Oil lamps were lit, but they gave only small circles of light in the overwhelming dark. The noise was enormous. The roar of the eruption, the crash of falling pumice, the shrieks of animals, the cries of people calling to one another in the darkness. The air was thick with sulfurous gases and fine volcanic dust that made breathing difficult, and the eyes streamed with tears. For several hours, the pumice fall continued at a relatively steady rate, accumulating perhaps 15 centimeters per hour. By evening, the depth of pumice in the streets of Pompeii was already knee-deep, making movement difficult. Many residents had retreated to the upper floors of their houses as the lower levels filled with debris. Others crowded into the more solidly built public buildings, the temples and the baths, hoping that their thick walls and heavy vaulted roofs would offer protection. Then, in the middle of the night or early in the morning of August 25, the character of the eruption changed. The Plinian column collapsed. This is one of the most dangerous events that can occur during a volcanic eruption, and it is what transformed the eruption of Vesuvius from a terrible but survivable disaster into one of the most complete and rapid destructions of a city in recorded history. When the eruption column collapsed, the mixture of hot gas, ash, and rock that had been shooting upward suddenly reversed direction and flowed outward from the volcano in all directions as pyroclastic surges and flows, the most lethal products of explosive volcanism. A pyroclastic surge is a low-density cloud of hot gas and fine ash that moves at hurricane speeds along the ground, capable of reaching temperatures of several hundred degrees Celsius and traveling at speeds of over 100 kilometers per hour. Nothing can survive the passage of a pyroclastic surge. It incinerates everything it touches, strips bark from trees, melts glass, and kills every living thing instantaneously. A pyroclastic flow, denser and slightly slower, is a mixture of hot gas, pumice, and heavier particles that flows along the ground like a devastating avalanche of hot debris. When the first pyroclastic surge reached Pompeii in the early hours of August 25, it killed everyone remaining in the city instantaneously. The temperature of the surge was between 200 and 400 degrees Celsius, enough to vaporize soft tissue and shrink the brain within the skull. The thousands of people who had sheltered in the city's buildings, who had hidden in cellars and bathrooms and under beds and in the vaults of the amphitheater, all died in the same moment, within seconds of the surge's arrival. They died in their positions, some crouching, some lying down, some covering their faces with their hands or their clothing, some embracing children or each other, and their bodies were immediately covered by the volcanic material that followed the surge. The subsequent pyroclastic flows buried Pompeii under meters of volcanic material, sealing the city in a deep layer of hardened ash and lapilli that would protect it from the elements for the next nearly 2,000 years. The hot material was deep enough and dense enough to prevent the organic material of the city, the wood of the furniture and the doors, the food in the stores, the bodies of the victims, from being consumed by oxygen. Instead, these materials carbonized or, in the case of soft tissue, eventually decayed, leaving cavities in the hardened volcanic material in the exact shape of the objects and bodies that had occupied them. Chapter 13. The death of Pliny the Elder, while the people of Pompeii were dying in the darkness. Across the bay at Stabii, Pliny the Elder was conducting himself with the peculiar mixture of scientific curiosity and aristocratic composure that characterized his life. His friend Pomponianus and the household at Stabii were terrified, but Pliny, according to his nephew's account, bathed, ate dinner, and went to bed, either sleeping or giving a very convincing impression of sleep, while outside the house the pumice accumulated and the sky glowed red with fire. In the early morning, as the situation became clearly untenable, the household decided to leave. They wrapped cushions over their heads to protect themselves from the falling pumice and made their way to the beach, where the sea was still too rough for the boats to put out. There, on the beach at Stabii, Pliny the Elder lay down on a spread cloth and asked twice for cold water to drink. Then the sulphurous fumes that accompanied the pyroclastic surges arrived, and the others fled, but Pliny could not stand. He remained on the beach and was found dead 2 days later when the survivors returned, his body intact and his face peaceful, lying as if he were asleep rather than dead. The cause of Pliny the Elder's death has been debated. His nephew suggests that he had a chronic weakness of the lungs, and that the sulfurous gases killed him more quickly than they might have killed a healthier person. Modern medical opinion has suggested that he may have died of a heart attack or stroke brought on by the stress and exertion of the escape attempt. Whatever the precise cause, the death of Pliny the Elder on the beach at Stabii is one of the most poignant events of the entire catastrophe, the death of one of the greatest intellects of the ancient world, a man who had devoted his life to the systematic observation and recording of the natural world, killed by the very natural forces he had spent his life studying. Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia, the vast encyclopedic work in 37 books that was the culmination of his scholarly career, survived his death and remained one of the most important reference works in the Western world through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. It contains not only descriptions of natural phenomena, but also extensive information about art, agriculture, medicine, and the products of human civilization, making it an indispensable source for historians of the ancient world. The book, ironically, has preserved far more of the world that Vesuvius destroyed than any single object that the volcano itself has preserved. Chapter 14. Herculaneum and Stabii. The other city's Pompeii was not the only city destroyed by Vesuvius in 79. The eruption claimed several other settlements in the region, most notably Herculaneum, Stabii, and Oplontes, each of which has its own story of destruction, and in the modern period, its own story of rediscovery and excavation. Herculaneum, a smaller and in some ways more refined city than Pompeii, stood about 7 kilometers to the northwest of Vesuvius, directly in the path of the most intense pyroclastic activity. Unlike Pompeii, which was buried primarily under relatively loose pumice and ash, Herculaneum was engulfed by the pyroclastic flows themselves, which poured through the city like a river of volcanic material at temperatures of 300 to 400 degrees Celsius. The pyroclastic material set hard around the buildings of Herculaneum, encasing them in a matrix of volcanic rock that was far more difficult to penetrate than the loose ash and pumice of Pompeii. This difference in the mode of burial had important consequences for preservation. At Herculaneum, the heat of the pyroclastic flows was intense enough to carbonize organic materials rather than simply destroying them, which meant that wooden furniture, wooden boxes and containers, textile fibers, papyrus scrolls, and even food items were preserved in carbonized form. The beds, tables, chairs, and doors of Herculaneum's houses survive in a way that they do not at Pompeii. The Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum, a magnificent seaside residence belonging to a member of Julius Caesar's father-in-law's family, contained a library of nearly 2,000 papyrus rolls, the largest collection of ancient texts found anywhere, which have been the subject of painstaking unrolling and decipherment efforts that continue to this day. The people of Herculaneum were, for many years, thought to have escaped the eruption, because the excavations of the 18th and early 19th centuries found relatively few human remains in the city itself. The discovery in the 1980s of more than 300 skeletons crowded into the boat chambers on the ancient beach of Herculaneum revised this picture dramatically. These people, who had crowded into the arched storage chambers on the beach, were apparently waiting for boats to rescue them when the first pyroclastic surge arrived. The surge killed them instantaneously, and the subsequent pyroclastic flows buried them in their shelter. The extraordinary preservation of the skeletons, still arranged as they were in the moment of death, has allowed biological anthropologists to reconstruct the health, diet, and physical characteristics of the ancient Herculanean population in remarkable detail. Oplontes, now the modern town of Torre Annunziata, was the site of a magnificent villa that is believed to have belonged to Poppaea Sabina, the wife of the Emperor Nero. The villa was a vast complex of rooms and gardens, decorated with some of the finest second-style wall paintings in existence, with garden views and architectural fantasies of extraordinary skill and beauty. It too was overwhelmed by the eruption of 79, and the bodies of refugees who had sought shelter in one of its rooms were found in the 20th century, huddled together with their valuables, waiting for a rescue that never came. Stabie, where Pliny the Elder died, was a resort community of villas strung along a ridge overlooking the bay, a place where wealthy Romans came for the sea air and the views. Several of its villas have been excavated and have yielded wall paintings and other finds of high quality, though the excavation history of Stabie is somewhat confused by the early diggings of the 18th century, which were conducted more as a treasure hunt than as systematic archaeological investigation. Chapter 15. The Long Sleep, 79 to 1748. After the eruption, the region around Vesuvius was transformed. The eruption had deposited meters of volcanic material over the former landscape, entirely eliminating the topographical features that had previously defined the area. The hill of Pompeii, the promontory where the city had stood, was buried so completely that it disappeared, and within a generation or two, perhaps faster, the very memory of where the city had been was lost. The surviving population of the region, those who had fled in time and survived, gradually returned to the area, but they settled elsewhere in new locations on the new volcanic surface, and the buried cities lay forgotten beneath their feet. This is not quite accurate, however. Roman writers continued to refer to the eruption of 79 and to the destruction of the cities around Vesuvius for some time afterward. The poet Martial, writing in the late 1st century, composed a moving elegy for the buried cities, lamenting that the vineyards of Vesuvius, where Bacchus had delighted to dwell, were now buried under fire and ash. The Emperor Titus, who was on the throne when the eruption occurred, visited the region immediately afterward and organized relief efforts, though the scale of the destruction was too great for meaningful reconstruction. A commission was appointed to redistribute the property of those who had died without heirs, and the proceeds were used to help the survivors. But the cities themselves were not rebuilt. Over the following centuries, the buried cities gradually receded from living memory. The name Pompeii survived in some form in the name of the area, as Civita, the city, reflecting the memory that a city had once existed there. Occasional finds of ancient objects made their way to the surface through agricultural activity, but they were not recognized for what they were. The topography of the area had been so thoroughly transformed by the eruption that there was nothing visible to indicate the presence of the buried cities. The olive trees and the vines grew over the volcanic surface. The farmers plowed their fields. The centuries passed. It was not until 1599 that the first accidental discovery of Pompeii was made, during the digging of an underground aqueduct channel. The architect Domenico Fontana, supervising the construction of a tunnel to carry water from the Sarno River to the Tower Mills at Torre Annunziata, encountered ancient walls and inscriptions in the course of the excavation. He may have found painted walls as well, though the evidence is uncertain. The inscriptions included the name Pompeii, But Fontana and his contemporaries interpreted this as a reference to a country estate of Pompey the Great, the Roman general, rather than as the name of a city. The discovery was noted and then forgotten. The real story of Pompeii's rediscovery begins in the 18th century, a period when the educated classes of Europe were becoming increasingly interested in classical antiquity, and when the first stirrings of scientific archaeology were beginning to replace the purely treasure-hunting approach to ancient sites that had previously dominated. In 1709, workers digging a well near Ricina, the modern town of Ercolano, struck the ancient theater of Herculaneum at a depth of several meters. The discovery was reported to the Prince d'Elbeuf, an Austrian military officer then serving in Naples, who organized systematic tunneling operations to extract the marbles and statues that were found. D'Elbeuf's operations were conducted in the most destructive manner possible, smashing through ancient walls to reach the valuable materials within, and discarding anything that seemed of lesser commercial value. Nevertheless, he retrieved a number of important finds, including several marble statues, which he sent to Vienna as gifts to Prince Eugene of Savoy, where they attracted considerable attention among the European cultural elite. When Charles of Bourbon became King of Naples in 1734, he took a more systematic interest in the ancient sites beneath his kingdom. In 1738, under the direction of the Spanish engineer Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre, excavations at Herculaneum were resumed on a more organized basis. Alcubierre's methods were still essentially those of a miner rather than an archaeologist. Tunnels were driven through the hardened volcanic rock in search of valuable objects, and the tunnels were then extended or abandoned as the finds suggested. But the operation was now under royal supervision, and finds were systematically catalogued and sent to the royal collection at Pompeii, which eventually became the nucleus of the National Archaeological Museum of Naples. In 1748, the excavations shifted to a new location, a site about 4 kilometers from Herculaneum on the slopes above the plain, where farmers had occasionally found ancient objects while plowing. On April 1, 1748, the workmen began to uncover something remarkable. The walls and floors of ancient buildings covered not in hardened volcanic rock like those at Herculaneum, but in a relatively loose layer of ash and pumice that could be removed with comparative ease. The site was Pompeii. Chapter 16. Rediscovery and wonder. The excavation of Pompeii in the 18th century was not, by any modern standard, systematic or scientific archaeology. It was conducted primarily as an exercise in treasure extraction, with workmen digging through the ash and pumice layers in search of valuable objects, coins, bronze vessels, marble statues, and fragments of the painted walls, which were cut from the buildings and transported to the royal collections at Pompeii. What was not considered valuable was often discarded or left in situ without adequate documentation. Human remains were frequently ignored or reburied without study. The architectural context of finds was rarely recorded with sufficient precision to allow later reconstruction. Nevertheless, the excavation of Pompeii produced sensational results, and the word spread rapidly through the courts and academies of Europe. The finds confirmed what classical texts had described: a city frozen in time, a Roman city of the 1st century of the Common Era preserved with a completeness that no other ancient site could match. The painted walls, the mosaic floors, the bronze furniture, the carbonized food, the everyday objects of Roman life, all appeared in a state of preservation that seemed almost miraculous. The excavations attracted a stream of distinguished visitors, intellectuals, artists, and aristocrats from throughout Europe, who came to Naples and obtained royal permission to descend into the excavation trenches. Among the most influential of these early visitors was the German art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann, whose writings on the finds at Herculaneum and Pompeii played a major role in shaping the neoclassical movement in European art and architecture. Winckelmann's concept of noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, as the defining qualities of ancient Greek and Roman art, was partly formed by his encounters with the works emerging from the volcanic earth of Campania. His descriptions of the finds, written in passionate, lyrical prose, helped to create the vogue for things classical that would dominate European artistic taste for the next several decades. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe visited Pompeii in 1787 and described the experience in his Italian journey as one of the great intellectual shocks of his life. The sight of the ancient city, its streets and buildings still standing, its spaces still legible, produced in him a kind of temporal vertigo, a sudden and overwhelming sense of the nearness of the ancient world. Goethe was not the first to have this experience, and he would not be the last. Pompeii has that effect on visitors. It collapses the distance between the present and the past in a way that no museum, however magnificently organized, can quite replicate. The social and cultural impact of the Pompeian discoveries on 18th century Europe was enormous. The neoclassical movement in architecture, which produced buildings from Edinburgh to Washington, D.C. that drew on Roman models, was given new energy and new specific references by the Pompeian finds. The decorative arts were transformed. The Pompeian style of interior decoration, with its red and black color schemes, its friezes of mythological figures and fantastic architectural ornaments, and its characteristic use of the arabesque, became a fashionable choice for the dining rooms and libraries of the European elite. Wedgwood pottery, the furniture of Robert Adam, the interior decoration of Napoleonic France, all show the direct influence of Pompeian motifs. The 19th century brought changes to the approach to Pompeian excavation that, while still far from what we would today call scientific archaeology, represented genuine improvements over the treasure-hunting approach of the 18th century. The key figure in this transformation was Giuseppe Fiorelli, who was appointed director of the Pompeii excavations in 1860 following the unification of Italy. Fiorelli introduced a systematic approach to excavation, dividing the site into numbered regions and insulae, city blocks, and requiring that all finds be documented in their precise location before removal. He also introduced the technique that would become one of the most powerful tools for communicating the human reality of Pompeii's destruction, the plaster cast. Chapter 17. The plaster casts the discovery that the bodies of Pompeii's victims had left cavities in the hardened volcanic material, was made early in the excavation of the site. The material, a mixture of ash, pumice, and fine volcanic particles, had set hard around the bodies of the dead, preserving the exact shape of their forms while the soft tissue decayed over the centuries, leaving a perfectly shaped void in the matrix of volcanic rock. Fiorelli realized that these voids could be filled with liquid plaster, creating a three-dimensional cast of the victim's body at the moment of death. The first plaster casts were made in 1863, and they caused an immediate sensation. Here were not simply the bones of ancient people, which were disturbing enough, but something far more intimate and far more terrible. The preserved forms of human beings in their last moments, their postures and expressions captured with horrifying precision. A man lying on his side with his hand raised to his face as if to ward off the fatal cloud. A woman with her skirts drawn up around her face, preserving modesty even in death. A child curled in the fetal position as if asleep. A dog twisted in agony, its collar still visible around its neck, its muscles contracted in the extremity of its death throes. The plaster casts of Pompeii are among the most affecting objects in the entire history of archaeology, and they have had an extraordinary impact on how the modern world understands and relates to the ancient past. They transform the abstract idea of historical catastrophe into something immediate and personal. They make it impossible to regard the destruction of Pompeii as a merely historical event, safely distant in time, and therefore safely abstract. These are people, specific, individual people with specific postures and specific expressions, and they died in a specific, terrible moment that is still somehow present in the form preserved in the volcanic rock. Over the years since Fiorelli's first casts, dozens more have been made, and the techniques have been refined. In some cases, the liquid plaster has been supplemented with clear resins or epoxy compounds that allow the preserved bone to be seen within the cast, combining the external form preserved in the rock cavity with the skeletal structure of the individual. More recently, three-dimensional scanning and CT scanning technology have been used to examine the casts non-destructively, revealing details of clothing, jewelry, and even hairstyle that might not have been visible on the surface of the cast. The casts have also enabled bioarchaeological study of the victims. Analysis of the preserved bone within the casts has allowed researchers to determine the age, sex, and general health of individual victims, to identify signs of disease or injury, to examine their dental health as an indicator of diet and nutrition, and in some cases to extract ancient DNA for genetic analysis. These studies have produced a picture of Pompeii's population that is far richer and more detailed than anything that historical texts could provide, allowing us to see not just the general outlines of Roman society, but the specific biological reality of the individuals who made up that society. The most extensive collection of plaster casts can be seen in the Garden of the Fugitives, in the southwestern part of the excavated area of Pompeii, where 13 victims, including several children and what appears to be a family group, were found together and cast in their positions. Walking among these casts, seeing the postures of people in the moments of their deaths, the arms raised, the bodies twisted, the hands clasped, is an experience that many visitors to Pompeii describe as the most powerful of their entire visit. There is something here that goes beyond historical interest or aesthetic appreciation. It is a confrontation with mortality itself, with the universal human fact of death and the particular historical fact of these specific deaths, that strikes at something very deep. Chapter 18. The science of Pompeii. Modern archaeology at Pompeii is a very different discipline from the excavation activities of the 18th and 19th centuries. It draws on a wide range of scientific techniques that were unavailable to earlier generations of excavators, techniques that allow the extraction of vastly more information from the physical remains of the city than was possible before. At the same time, the profession has developed a much more sophisticated understanding of what is at stake in the excavation of an irreplaceable site, and the emphasis today is as much on preservation and conservation as on discovery and excavation. The most fundamental scientific contribution to the understanding of Pompeii in recent decades has been the application of volcanological analysis to the deposits that buried the city. By studying the sequence of volcanic layers in the stratigraphy of the site, volcanologists have been able to reconstruct the precise sequence of events during the eruption with a level of detail that goes far beyond what the ancient literary sources could provide. The work of Harald Sigurdsson and his colleagues in the 1980s established the basic sequence of Plinian fallout, pyroclastic surges, and pyroclastic flows that resulted in the destruction of Pompeii, and subsequent work has refined and extended this analysis. The analysis of human remains, both the plaster casts and the loose skeletons found throughout the excavation, has provided important data about the health and demography of the ancient population. The work of physical anthropologists at both Pompeii and Herculaneum has revealed that the ancient inhabitants of these cities were, in general, reasonably well-nourished and in relatively good health by ancient standards, though they suffered from many of the diseases that plagued ancient populations. Dental caries, periodontal disease, evidence of childhood malnutrition in some individuals, and the various degenerative conditions associated with heavy physical labor. The study of plant and animal remains found in the city, the field known as environmental archaeology, has produced a remarkably detailed picture of the ecology and food production systems of ancient Pompeii. Analysis of carbonized seeds and plant remains reveals the full range of crops cultivated in the region. wheat and barley for bread, grapes for wine, olives for oil, figs, pomegranates, plums, cherries, walnuts, almonds, and a wide variety of vegetables including cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, and various legumes. The fish bones and shellfish remains from kitchen and food waste deposits identify the species consumed. Sea bream, sea bass, mackerel, tuna, eel, mullet, various shellfish and crustaceans. A diet that makes any modern Italian seafood restaurant seem almost unambitious. Chemical analysis of the residues in the storage vessels and cooking pots of Pompeii has allowed identification of the specific foodstuffs and preparations contained in them. Wine residues in amphorae have been analyzed to determine their alcohol content and to identify the grape varieties used. Olive oil residues reveal information about production methods and quality. Garum residues identify the fish species used in its preparation. These analyses, combined with the textual evidence from ancient cookbooks and agricultural manuals, are assembling a picture of Roman food culture at Pompeii that is both impressively detailed and surprisingly familiar in many of its elements. The study of Pompeii's economy has been transformed by the application of systematic spatial analysis to the distribution of commercial establishments and craft workshops in the city. Earlier scholarship tended to treat the commercial life of Pompeii as essentially independent of its social life, but more recent work, particularly the influential studies of Andrew Wallace Hadrill and his colleagues, has shown that the commercial and the domestic were deeply intertwined in the ancient city, and that the simple division between private house and public shop that we take for granted in modern urban life did not exist in the same form in the ancient world. Many of the buildings that appear to be private houses in Pompeii contained commercial activities on their ground floors. Shops opened from their front walls onto the street, their counters serving customers from outside, while the interior of the building remained the domestic space of the family. Workshops occupied rooms that opened onto internal courtyards. Gardens that appear purely aesthetic were in fact productive kitchen gardens and market gardens. The house was not a refuge from the commercial world but a site of commercial activity, and the line between the domestic and the economic was always permeable and often invisible. Chapter 19. The ongoing excavation. Pompeii is not fully excavated. More than 2,000 years after the eruption that buried it, roughly a third of the city remains under the ground, unexcavated and unavailable to visitors. The decision to leave this portion of the site unexcavated is not simply the result of inadequate resources, though resources are always a constraint, but reflects a considered archaeological judgment that the unexcavated areas are better preserved under their protective covering of volcanic material than they would be if exposed to the elements, and that future generations, equipped with better techniques than those available today, should have the opportunity to excavate them under optimal conditions. The excavated portions of Pompeii are themselves subject to ongoing conservation challenges. Pompeii is one of the largest open-air archaeological sites in the world, and the exposure of its structures to rain, frost, biological growth, tourist traffic, and the effects of modern atmospheric pollution has caused serious deterioration in many areas. The painted walls, which survived 2,000 years under volcanic protection, have been damaged significantly in the 2.5 centuries since their exposure, and the rate of deterioration has accelerated in recent decades with the growth of mass tourism. The site receives more than 3 million visitors annually, and the physical impact of this level of visitation, the vibrations caused by footsteps, the moisture from breath and perspiration, the inadvertent touching of surfaces, creates preservation problems that are difficult and expensive to manage. In response to these challenges, the Italian government has invested substantially in the conservation and management of Pompeii in recent years, with significant support from European Union funding. The Grand Progetto Pompeii, a major program of restoration and consolidation work launched in 2012, has produced impressive results in the stabilization of deteriorating structures and the improvement of visitor management. New excavation campaigns, particularly in the previously unexcavated areas of Reggio V, have produced remarkable new discoveries that have attracted worldwide attention and significantly expanded our understanding of the city. The excavations in Reggio V, ongoing since 2017, have already produced a series of extraordinary finds. The discovery of a thermopolium with remarkable preservation of food residues in its dolia has provided new detailed information about the diet of ordinary Pompeians. A large ceremonial chariot, decorated with bronze and tin fittings and with elaborate mythological scenes, was found in a stable complex in the northern part of the city, preserved in remarkable condition. A fresco depicting two men reclining at a feast, their identities and the nature of their relationship, a matter of scholarly debate, was found in a small house and has attracted considerable attention for the intimacy and psychological complexity of its depiction. Dozens of new graffiti have been recorded, adding to the extraordinary corpus of ancient voices that make Pompeii so uniquely alive. Perhaps most remarkably, the ongoing excavations have begun to provide evidence that may revise the traditionally accepted date of the eruption. Among the finds from Reggio V was a charcoal inscription, written in charcoal on a plastered wall, that gave a date corresponding to October 17 of some year, now interpreted as 79 of the Common Era. If this is correct, the eruption occurred not in late August but in late October or early November, a cooler time of year that would explain some of the otherwise puzzling features of the archaeological record, including the heavy woolen clothing on some victims and the autumn food remains in certain establishments. The debate continues, but it is a vivid reminder that Pompeii still has secrets to reveal. Chapter 20. Pompeii and the Understanding of Ancient Rome. The significance of Pompeii for our understanding of the ancient Roman world can hardly be overstated. Without Pompeii, and to a lesser extent Herculaneum and the other sites buried by Vesuvius, our knowledge of how ordinary Romans lived would be vastly thinner and less reliable than it is. The literary sources that survive from the ancient world tell us a great deal about the lives of the wealthy and the politically prominent, about the battles and the governance, and the intellectual debates of the Roman elite. But they tell us very little about the daily lives of the common people, the craftsmen and traders and freedmen and slaves who made up the vast majority of the population. Pompeii fills this gap. In Pompeii, we can see the actual tools that carpenters and metalworkers used. We can measure the dimensions of the beds in which ordinary people slept. We can read the prices chalked on the walls of shops. We can see the equipment of the fishermen and the bakers and the fulleries, and understand in precise, material detail how these trades were actually conducted. We can walk through the streets and understand the spatial organization of a Roman city, the relationship between public and private space, the patterns of pedestrian movement, the locations of the water supply and waste disposal systems. We can see the decoration of ordinary houses, and understand that the aspiration toward beauty and luxury was not confined to the super-rich, but pervaded Roman society at all levels. Pompeii has also been important for understanding Roman religion, which was long studied primarily through the lens of the great state temples and the literary sources on official cult. At Pompeii, the full richness and variety of Roman religious life is visible. The official temples of the Forum, the mystery religion of Isis, the household shrines in every home, the street corner shrines at every major intersection, the magical and apotropaic objects that protected doorways and warded off the evil eye, the graffiti invoking the protection of the gods. This was a world saturated with the divine, in which the boundary between the sacred and the profane was always permeable, and in which the management of relationships with divine powers was a constant and everyday preoccupation. The study of Pompeii has also fundamentally changed our understanding of Roman domestic life, and particularly of the role of women in Roman society. The legal position of Roman women, as defined in the texts of Roman law and the prescriptive literature written by elite male authors, was one of significant subordination and restriction. But the material evidence from Pompeii tells a more complex story. Women appear as active economic agents, managing businesses, making investments, participating in commercial networks. Women appear as patrons of public buildings and religious establishments, exercising the same forms of civic urgetism as men of comparable wealth. Women appear as the owners of valuable property and the subjects of legal transactions. The gap between the prescriptive ideology of Roman womanhood and the lived reality of women's lives in a Roman city is one of the most interesting findings of Pompeian archaeology. Chapter 21. Legacy and Memory. The story of Pompeii does not end with the eruption of 79. In a very real sense, it continues to unfold. The city that was frozen in its last moment by volcanic catastrophe has, in the 2.5 centuries since its modern rediscovery, been reborn as one of the most powerful symbols in the cultural imagination of the Western world. A symbol of beauty and destruction, of the fragility of civilization, of the proximity of death to everyday life, of the irreversible passage of time. In literature, Pompeii has inspired an extraordinary range of creative responses. Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel The Last Days of Pompeii, published in 1834, was one of the best-selling novels of the 19th century and remains in print today. Bulwer Lytton's Pompeii is a melodramatic romance set against the backdrop of the eruption, peopled with noble Greeks and villainous priests of Isis and brave blind flower girls. And it is not, by modern scholarly standards, a very accurate picture of ancient Pompeii, but it captured something important: the emotional power of the site, the sense of a world preserved at the moment of its extinction, and it introduced Pompeii to a vast reading public that would not otherwise have encountered the ancient city. In art, the influence of Pompeii has been pervasive and persistent. The neoclassical movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries drew heavily on Pompeian models, and the characteristic red and black color schemes, the friezes of dancing figures, the architectural fantasies of Pompeian wall painting can be traced through the decorative arts of Europe from the time of the first excavations to the present day. The works of John Martin, whose apocalyptic canvases of volcanic destruction include a famous painting of the destruction of Pompeii, brought the imagery of the volcanic catastrophe to a wide popular audience. The photographs of Giorgio Sommer and Michel Amodio in the late 19th century brought the visual reality of the excavations to an even wider one. In music, in film, in theater, in opera, Pompeii has served as a setting, a subject, and a metaphor. The haunting imagery of the preserved city, its streets silent and empty, its walls painted with the colors of the living world, its plaster casts frozen in their last moments, has proved irresistible to artists working in every medium. The rock band Pink Floyd filmed a concert film, Live at Pompeii, in the empty amphitheater of the ancient city in 1971, creating one of the most visually striking documents of rock music's relationship with antiquity. The Australian rock band Cold Chisel released an album called East in 1980, and the lead singer Jimmy Barnes has spoken about how the imagery of Pompeii influenced some of the themes of the album. More recently, various video games and virtual reality experiences have taken players through the streets of the ancient city in digital reconstructions of remarkable fidelity. In politics and social thought, Pompeii has served as a meditation on the vulnerability of civilization and on the indifference of the natural world to human achievement. The volcanic landscape of Campania, which produced the fertile soil that made Pompeii prosperous and the volcanic activity that destroyed it, embodies a paradox that has resonated through European culture. The same forces that create also destroy. The same earth that nourishes also kills. Giacomo Leopardi's great poem La Ginestra, written in 1836 on the slopes of Vesuvius, uses the survival of the humble broom plant on the volcanic slopes as a meditation on human pride and the power of nature, arguing that true courage consists not in the human delusion of mastery over nature, but in the clear-eyed acknowledgement of our fragility and our mortality. Chapter 22. What the walls say. To understand Pompeii fully, you must read its walls. Not just the formal inscriptions on the temples and the public buildings, not just the painted electoral notices and the advertisements for gladiatorial shows, but the informal, spontaneous, personal writing that covers every available surface throughout the city. The graffiti of Pompeii are among the most direct and personal testimonials to ancient life that survive from the ancient world, and they deserve far more attention than they typically receive in the popular presentation of the site. The graffiti were scratched into plaster with a metal or bone stylus, or written in ink or charcoal with a stick or a pen, by people of all social classes in places all over the city. Some are in the careful, educated hand of a trained scribe. Others are almost unreadable, the letters unsteady and the spelling approximate, written by someone who could barely read, let alone write. Most are somewhere in between, the casual handwriting of ordinary people expressing ordinary thoughts in ordinary language. Love, of course, is the dominant theme. The Pompeians were as besotted with love, as desperate in pursuit of it and as desolate in its absence as any people who have ever lived. The walls are full of love declarations, love complaints, love insults. I love Quartilla who cares nothing for me. Secundus to his primigenia, you are my sweetness. Marcus loves Spendusa, Vibius to Restituta. I greet you and beg you to love me in return. These are not the formal expressions of a literary culture. They are the raw, immediate outpourings of human feeling, preserved on walls that were intended for other purposes, written because the person who wrote them could not contain what they felt and needed to put it somewhere. But the graffiti cover much more than love. There are insults, often specific and personal. Antiochus hung out here with his girlfriend Cythera. The neighbors to Lucilius, you can stuff it. There are boasts, I fucked the barmaid here. There are accounts and financial records, the kind of thing a shopkeeper or innkeeper might scrawl on the wall to keep track of transactions. There are observations, sometimes philosophical, sometimes trivial. The spider weaves its web on the door hinge. The traveler passes. Nothing lasts forever. There are lists of names, apparently random, probably representing either drinking companions or the members of some association. There are fragments of poetry, literary quotations, bits of songs, advertising slogans, reminders, instructions. One of the most touching categories of Pompeian graffiti is the simple marking of existence. I was here, writes one anonymous hand. Marcus was here. Lucius Aemilius Cellerinus was here and wrote his name. These are the ancient equivalent of the modern tourist's impulse to carve one's initials in the bark of a tree or to sign a guest book, the most basic and most universal of human desires. To leave a mark, to say that one existed, to cry out against the indifference of time. And Pompeii, with its extraordinary preservation, has given those marks a permanence that no one who made them could ever have anticipated. The most famous graffito in Pompeii is also one of the simplest. Written on a wall in the region near the Via dell'Abbondanza, it says only, ADMIXTA. The word means mixed or blended. Scholars have proposed various interpretations, but none has achieved general acceptance. It may be a reference to wine, to food, to people, to the mixture of the living and the dead that Pompeii embodies. It is a mystery, as Pompeii is ultimately a mystery, a voice from the past speaking clearly but in words whose meaning has been blurred by time. Chapter 23. Pompeii in the 21st century. In the 21st century, Pompeii faces challenges that would have been unimaginable to the archaeologists of the 18th and 19th centuries. The primary challenge is conservation. How to preserve a site of this scale and complexity in the face of the physical forces that threaten it. The 3 million or more visitors who pass through Pompeii annually are, paradoxically, both the primary justification for the enormous expense of maintaining and conserving the site, and one of the primary sources of the damage that makes conservation so necessary. The impact of tourism on Pompeii is complex and multifaceted. The vibration caused by millions of footsteps on the ancient paving stones contributes to the structural deterioration of the buildings that line the streets. The moisture exhaled by thousands of visitors daily creates conditions that promote the growth of algae, mosses, and other biological organisms on the painted walls, gradually obscuring and destroying the ancient paintings. The inadvertent touching of surfaces, despite the restrictions and barriers that are meant to prevent it, causes physical abrasion. The pollution generated by the vehicles that bring visitors to the site contributes to the chemical deterioration of the volcanic materials and the ancient building materials. At the same time, the revenue generated by tourism provides the financial resources necessary to fund the conservation work that is the site's only hope of long-term preservation. This is a fundamental tension that has no easy resolution, and the management of Pompeii has struggled with it for decades. Various strategies have been tried, including the restriction of access to the most fragile areas, the provision of alternative digital and virtual experiences for visitors who cannot see the originals, the rotation of access to different areas of the site to allow periods of recovery, and the active conservation of the most threatened structures and paintings. The most ambitious conservation initiative in the site's recent history is the Grand Progetto Pompeii. Launched in 2012 with funding from the Italian government and the European Union, totaling approximately 105 million euros. The project has funded the restoration and consolidation of dozens of structures throughout the site, the improvement of drainage system to reduce the water damage caused by rainstorms, the improvement of visitor management and access, the digitization of the site's archaeological archives, and the training of a new generation of conservation specialists. The results have been impressive. Structures that were collapsing have been stabilized, paintings that were deteriorating have been conserved, and the overall condition of the site has improved significantly. The new excavations in Reggio V, begun in 2017 as part of the Grand Progetto, have demonstrated that systematic, scientific archaeology at Pompeii is still capable of producing finds of the greatest historical and cultural significance. The discoveries of the past few years, the chariot, the thermopolium, the new frescoes, the new graffiti, the skeletal remains that continue to reveal new information about the biology and demography of the ancient population, have attracted worldwide media attention and revived public interest in the site after a period in which the emphasis had necessarily been on conservation rather than discovery. Chapter 24. The Lessons of Pompeii. What does Pompeii teach us? The question is deceptively simple, and the answers are many and various and depend on who is asking and what they are looking for. For the archaeologist, Pompeii teaches the principles and practices of systematic excavation and documentation, and demonstrates with unrivaled clarity what can be lost when those principles are ignored. For the historian, Pompeii provides an incomparable archive of the material culture of the Roman world, a dataset of physical evidence that puts the textual sources in a context of lived reality that transforms our ability to understand them. For the architect, Pompeii provides a library of building forms and construction techniques that has been studied and drawn and measured since the Renaissance. For the artist, Pompeii provides an inexhaustible source of images, motifs, compositions, and color relationships that have influenced Western visual culture for 2.5 centuries. But beyond all these professional and disciplinary lessons, Pompeii teaches something more fundamental, something that has nothing to do with archaeology or history or art history. It teaches the lesson of impermanence. It teaches that everything we build, however solid it seems, however permanent it feels, however much we invest it with our love and our ambition and our daily living, is ultimately subject to forces beyond our control and our comprehension. The Pompeians built a city that they expected to last forever, or at least as long as Rome itself lasted, which amounted to the same thing. They decorated it with extraordinary care and skill, investing their wealth and their imagination in the creation of beauty. They conducted their elections and their business and their festivals and their daily rituals with the full conviction that these things would continue indefinitely. And in the space of a day and a night, it was all gone. This is a lesson that every generation needs to learn, and that every generation tends to forget. The human tendency to assume the permanence of the present, to plan for a future that is merely an extension of the existing order, to forget that the ground beneath our feet may not be as solid as it seems, is as strong today as it was in Pompeii in the summer of 79. The cities we build, the institutions we maintain, the cultures we inherit and transmit, all of these are subject to the same impermanence that the Pompeians discovered in the most terrible way possible. But Pompeii also teaches the opposite lesson, and the two are in a tension that is part of what makes the site so enduringly compelling. The lesson of impermanence is accompanied by a lesson about the persistence of human traces. The Pompeians died and their city was destroyed, but their words and their images and their daily objects survived. The woman who read a letter in a garden 2,000 years ago has gone, but the painting of her reading is still here, the colors still vivid, the gesture of her hand still legible. The man who scratched his love declaration on a wall in the Via dell'Abbondanza is gone, but his words are still there, still carrying the weight of whatever he felt in the moment of writing them. The baker who stamped his name on the loaves he baked that last morning is gone, but the loaves, carbonized but intact, still carry his name. The persistence of these traces is not miraculous, though it can feel that way. It is the result of specific physical circumstances, the chemistry of volcanic ash and the absence of oxygen, that preserved what would otherwise have decayed. But the emotional reality of encountering these traces is indistinguishable from what we might feel about a miracle. To hold a Pompeian coin that still shows the head of a Roman emperor with perfect sharpness is to experience an almost physical shock of connection across time. To read a Pompeian graffito and understand what it says is to experience the communication that its author intended, 2,000 years after the message was written. This is what history at its most powerful does. It makes the dead present. Pompeii makes the dead more present than any other historical site in the world. This is both its gift and its burden. It is a city that died, and it is a city that speaks. It is a place where the past is not safely past, but is continually breaking through into the present, where the distance between then and now is not a comfortable academic abstraction, but a felt reality, experienced in the worn surface of a stone water fountain, and the faded brushstrokes of a painted wall, and the contorted form of a plaster cast in a garden. It is a place that asks questions that have no easy answers. What do we owe the dead? What is the obligation of the living to the past? How should we remember those who have no one left to remember them? These are not questions that archaeology or history alone can answer. They are questions that belong to ethics and to philosophy and to the deepest levels of human experience. But Pompeii makes them impossible to avoid. It insists, with the silent eloquence of its preserved streets and its thousand small human traces, that the people who lived here mattered, that their lives were real and their loves were real and their fears were real, and that something is owed to them, some act of attention, of imagination, of respect, by those of us who come after and look at what remains. Chapter 25. The voices in the ash to walk through Pompeii at dusk, when the tourist groups have gone and the site is quiet, when the late light falls golden on the volcanic stone, and the shadows pool in the doorways of the ancient houses, is one of the most extraordinary experiences available to any human being anywhere in the world. The streets are empty in the way that the streets of any city are empty in the small hours of the morning, with the quality of a pause, a held breath, a moment between one thing and another. The painted walls glow softly in the slanting light. The wheel ruts in the paving stones catch the shadows and deepen. The stepping stones at the intersections cast long shadows across the street's surface. In these moments, it is possible to feel something that no amount of scholarly analysis or archaeological interpretation can produce. The simple, overwhelming presence of the past. Pompeii is not a reconstruction. It is not a theme park or a museum display. It is the actual place where actual people lived and worked and loved and died, and the physical reality of that place, its stones and its streets and its silence, carries a weight of human experience that is palpable. The city is still here. The eruption that destroyed it also preserved it, and the preservation is so complete and so intimate that the destruction seems, in these quiet moments, almost impossible to believe. And yet the destruction happened. The plaster casts in the Garden of the Fugitives are the permanent, unanswerable reminder of that. These twisted, agonized forms, these people frozen in their last moments, these children curled against their mothers' bodies, these men with their arms raised to ward off the approaching cloud, are always there, always present, always asking the question that Pompeii ultimately asks of every visitor. What does it mean that we are here and they are not? There is no answer to that question. There is only the question itself, and the experience of standing in the ancient city and feeling its weight. Pompeii endures not despite its destruction, but because of it, preserved by the same catastrophe that killed it, surviving into the present as a testament to the lives lived within its walls. It is a city that was lost and found, destroyed and preserved, silenced and given voice again after nearly 2,000 years of darkness. And in the evening light, walking its streets, reading its walls, looking at its paintings, you can hear, if you listen carefully, the voices of the people who made it. Arguing, laughing, complaining, declaring their love, recording their presence, insisting on being remembered. Veil, Pompeii, farewell. And yet also Ave, hail, for you are not entirely gone. Epilogue. What remains in the National Archaeological Museum of Naples, in a large room on the upper floor, stands the Alexander mosaic. It is one of the largest and most complex mosaics from the ancient world, measuring approximately 5.5 by 3 meters, composed of approximately 1.5 million individual tesserae of natural stone, each one cut by hand to a precise shape, and laid with extraordinary skill to create an image of devastating pictorial power. The scene depicted is the battle between Alexander the Great and Darius III of Persia, probably the Battle of Issus in 333 before the Common Era, and it shows the moment of Darius's flight from the battlefield, his chariot turning to escape, while Alexander drives his horse directly at the Persian king, his spear having just pierced one of Darius's officers. The mosaic was made in the late 2nd or early 1st century before the Common Era, probably in Pompeii itself or somewhere in Campania, and it lay on the floor of the House of the Faun for perhaps 200 years before the eruption. It survived the eruption because the hardened volcanic material that buried it protected it from the elements, and it was excavated, at great difficulty, in the 1830s and transported to Naples. It now rests in the museum in a climate-controlled room, visited by tens of thousands of people every year. To stand before the Alexander mosaic is to confront the full paradox of Pompeii. Here is a work of art that was created by craftsmen whose names we do not know, for a patron whose name we do not know, depicting an event that happened 3 centuries before the work was made, preserved by the eruption that destroyed the city in which it stood, excavated 2,000 years after that eruption, and now displayed in a museum where it will, with proper care, survive for centuries more. The anonymous craftsmen who laid each tiny stone are long gone. The patron who commissioned the work is long gone. The men who fought at Issus are long gone. The city of Pompeii is gone. And yet the mosaic remains, as vivid and as powerful as the day it was completed, the tiny stones still catching the light and turning it into image, the horses still lunging, the spear still flying, Alexander's eye still fixed on Darius with an expression of terrible, unstoppable intensity. This is what Pompeii gives us. Not the illusion that the past can be recovered, not the fantasy that the dead can be restored to life, but something more honest and more moving than either of those things. It gives us the physical traces of the past, the actual objects that were touched and used and made by actual people, carrying in their matter the record of human lives and human experiences that would otherwise be entirely lost. It gives us the voices in the ash, speaking across 2,000 years in the language of things, insisting on the reality of what was, on the weight of what has been lost, and on the irreducible human significance of every life that was lived in the shadow of the mountain. The mountain is still there. It rose above the Bay of Naples before Pompeii was built, and it will rise there long after the last visitor has left the excavated city. Its slopes are covered with vines and gardens, as they were in 79. Its crater sits quiet under the Italian sky, monitored by a network of seismographic instruments maintained by the Vesuvius Observatory, which was established in 1841 and is the oldest volcanological observatory in the world. The scientists who work there know that Vesuvius will erupt again. They do not know when. The Naples metropolitan area, one of the most densely populated regions of Europe, spreads up the mountain's lower slopes, millions of people living in the shadow of the same volcano that destroyed Pompeii. The evacuation plans that have been drawn up by Italian civil protection authorities describe a complex choreography of population movement that would be required when, not if, Vesuvius erupts again. The plans involve the evacuation of more than 3 million people in a period of 72 hours, using every available road and rail and maritime route. Whether such a plan could actually be executed in the chaos of a volcanic emergency is a question that no one can answer with confidence. The people of the region, like the people of Pompeii before them, tend to regard Vesuvius with the comfortable familiarity of long acquaintance, rather than the alert vigilance that the situation perhaps demands. Perhaps this is not simply complacency. Perhaps it is also a form of wisdom, the wisdom of people who have chosen to live with a beautiful and dangerous thing, because the beauty and the danger are inseparable, because the volcanic soil that could kill them also feeds them, because the mountain that overshadows them also defines them, because this specific place, with all its risks and all its gifts, is their home. The Pompeians, if they were able to speak to us across the 2,000 years that separate their world from ours, might not understand our concern. They lived well, in a beautiful city, in a beautiful place, and when the end came, it came quickly and without warning, and without the agonizing prolongation that so many deaths involve. They had not known what was beneath the mountain. They had not known what was coming. We know. And still we find ourselves drawn back to the ancient streets, to the painted walls and the worn stepping stones and the plaster casts in the garden. We find ourselves reading the graffiti on the walls, trying to hear the voices of the people who wrote them. We find ourselves standing in the Forum in the late afternoon light, looking at the Temple of Jupiter at the northern end, and the mountains behind it and the sky above, and feeling something that is partly sadness and partly wonder, and partly something that does not have a name, something that the ancient Romans would perhaps have called pietas, duty and devotion and love all mixed together, directed not at the gods but at the dead, at these specific dead, in this specific place, who lived and loved and worked and argued and painted their walls, and stamped their names on their bread, and scratched their declarations on the plaster surfaces that would outlast them by 2,000 years and counting. Pompeii endures, it will endure, the end.